What's up, everyone? How y'all doing this weekend? My name is Nick. I'm with Anticonquista, one of the co-editors. I'm here with Miguel, who recently joined us. How you doing, Miguel?
How's it going, Nick?
Pretty good, man. Pretty good. It's been raining out here, but I'm doing all
Okay.
right. Doing all right. So we know we have last week we took a week off. We've been doing this. We look back. We've been doing this now for almost 4 months. I think this is episode 15 or 16 now. So it's been going pretty well. These weekly news updates and roundups. I think it's really important. We've talked about the importance of this work in terms of solidarity, of keeping ourselves updated with what's going on in Latin America. And in the last couple of weeks, we've had a lot of really interesting, big topics come out, big news break. One of the biggest things that we're going to focus a lot on for this episode is going to be the leaks around the Pandora papers and a lot of the corruption which has been exposed in Latin America and really throughout the world. So we'll get started with that right away. And I guess first things first is, and I'm interested what you think about this, Miguel. So the Pandora papers showed a leak mostly of Latin American, I think a lot of Ukrainian,
hmm
UK, like liberal and right wing leaders and such. So it mostly comes from people from outside of the United States. But it does show that the United States is a tax haven. Specifically, they named South Dakota as a big tax haven for a lot of these individuals. But we've seen these leaks before. We saw them with the Panama Papers. They were a little bit different. They had a lot. They were a lot more high. I want to say like high level leaders. These are seem to be a lot of no one in the United States is being named in the Pandora Papers, whereas in the Panama Papers they were. Um, and so these leaks really demonstrate kind of what I guess I want to say like the function of capitalism, what capitalism has always been about, which is corruption, right? Which is
hmm
funneling money and taking money for the rich to keep for themselves. And so I just get just the overall view, like with everything that's been talked about on this issue. Like, what are your thoughts, Miguel, on the Pandora papers, on the timing of their release, and whatever else might be before we get into like the real details.
Um, I think the timing. I don't know if there's anything coming up specifically, but I'm sure there was a reason why they dropped them last Sunday. Um, and then, like you said, what I found just interesting in regards to the United States is what you're talking about is these states like South Dakota, and then I think they mentioned Nevada and another state, but I think it was Nevada and South Dakota the main ones. With South Dakota being like the hot the hot spot for that is how their policies within their states, they're making it easier for people to hide their money there and not pay taxes. They're, offshore accounts are now coming to the states, whereas as the Pandora papers are talking about, most of these leaks, these are all international, where they hide their money around these offshore accounts. But I thought what they pointed out on that, like you said, is interesting because now we're seeing now they're using the United States as a tax haven, which the U.S. is the capitalist, the number one capitalist country, like when it comes to capitalism. So it's not like surprising that that's happening. And then there's all these other ways that people in the U.S. hide their money and they don't really pay too much in taxes, anyways. But
Right.
yeah, very interesting, especially with like South Dakota. Is that where do they have a Republican governor and she's very MAGA,
Yeah.
right? So finding out that that state was that wasn't surprising. It was that state, but then it like kind of well, there's that very right wing governor, so it makes sense as well.
Yeah, and that was so the South Dakota governor. She's the same one who was the one I think she like said she was gonna send South Dakota National Guard to the
Oh
border.
yeah.
Yeah, to help with. She's crazy, right? She's like not
She's
just
made
right.
those weird videos like promoting like
Yeah,
she's all with her freaking guns and shit.
yeah. So
Just some crazy right wing white lady.
yeah, exactly. She's one of those far right wing,
hmm
crazy types. But and you're right. You're right. There's no surprise. So it should be no surprise that it's her state that is letting this all happen. And it's interesting because it's so hypocritical because these MAGA types are the same ones who are going to be like, I'm for the average working class American, but at the same time, I'm going to create this tax haven for these big corporations because that's really where my
Mm-hmm.
interests lie. It's a bunch of bullshit, right? So these and Karina actually is in chat right now. She Christy Nome is the governor of South Dakota. So yeah, so that's the woman who really is behind is allowing this to happen. And you're right to say that.
Mm-hmm.
Like we have to acknowledge too that these tax havens didn't just come about, um, by some individuals. It wasn't just like Guillermo Lasso, who just kind of came up with this idea. Let me get a tax haven in the United States. No, I mean you have a team of lawyers, a team of politicians, a team of you have a whole team of financial advisors, people who are right there alongside you, helping you get this done, helping you, really funnel this money and skirt the law in ways that are just not possible for the average person. So, it's a lot more that goes into it, and you really get to what this does expose. I think is the systemic ways in which the financial capital works nowadays, and the U.S. being the center of it really is no surprise. We're the
And
center.
then
Yeah,
they
what's up?
didn't really in these leaks they haven't really there wasn't a mention too many of US politicians and stuff.
No,
But they kind of mentioned, hey, they're probably in some other offshore account that wasn't covered by these leaks.
right?
But as I was telling you offline, um, this is probably a controlled leak, even though it's important, and that's how we're talking about it. Like I'm sure there's other information that they didn't like drop, so there could be, some U.S. powerful U.S. people more involved that we don't know about. But they
Yeah,
did point out that they're probably in some other offshore account. So, but I
yeah,
don't know. I'm pretty sure there's some U.S. people that were more involved because they did kind of just focus on Latin American billionaires and leaders in Ukraine and Russia. Um, the
yeah.
the the ones you would think they would kind of talk about, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because a lot of the right wing leaders, I have seen people say what you're bringing up right now, and part of me, like I understand, I agree, like it is interesting that there's no like U.S. politicians that were implicated in this, but there were implicated in the Panama Papers, which were almost as large as
Hmm.
this one. And I think there's something to be said about that, but I also think at the same time, you see a lot of U.S. allies get thrown under the bus here. Like Tony
Yep.
Blair
Oh
was,
yeah, they mentioned Tony Blair. Hmm.
yeah, they threw him under the bus. Like I mentioned before, Lasso, the current president of Ecuador, who's a big right wing U.S. ally.
King Abdullah of Jordan.
Right. Yeah. So, you have U.S. allies on there, but it's interesting. They did steer away from any specific U.S. officials. Um, and you'll and let's be honest, they do that a lot. They said that you know they'll throw or what they usually do is they'll throw like U.S. allies under the bus if it's convenient. So, for example, the first thing I think of is in the DR when Trujillo became too much for the U.S. to deal with, even though he was historically a U.S. ally. They were quick to get him out of there. They literally were working with the movements, the organizations in the Dominican Republic that were going to assassinate him. So they'll get rid of their allies and they'll throw them under the bus when they need to.
Yep. It's when once they don't need them anymore.
Right, right. And I think it's important too to mention something that was mentioned in the previous program about what these leaks really mean in terms of corruption and how corruption it's important to look at corruption and understand how it works, but at the same time that's not really addressing the underlying systemic issues of capitalism.
Hmm.
Really it's just it's focusing on what capitalism really is, right? And I'm curious what your perspective on that is.
Um, it's just so these Pandora leaks were a little bigger
Right.
than these past ones. But we see the same pattern, and it's just the typical capitalist way they do things. How these billionaires, how these powerful people do things when it comes to capitalism and making money, and they're just they're getting more they're always finding ways and loopholes to hide their money. But that's kind of the part that's very I guess that's just a natural thing of capitalism in a way for them to do that, because the way to make money is you're gonna have to profit off people and you're gonna have to do shady shit. And so these leaks are just giving us more examples of how capitalism works and how these people, I guess, people like to talk about conspiracies and shit all the time, but this is a real example of the definition of conspiracy is people conspiring,
Exactly.
conspiring to do something secretive. And here it's about hiding their money, and it's not just just cash, but their real estate, other valuable properties. Like they even mention artwork in these leaks, like it could contain
Yeah.
all these things that just worth money, right? And so these are good examples of how capitalists conspire to keep the wealth to themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess we can get into more specific details about who exactly in Latin America, like how this relates to Latin
Mhm.
America. Um, and I think first, one of the things, well, first, I think before we get into that, one of the things I want to mention too is when we talk about these tax havens and how it relates to capitalism is a lot of what is being done here is not illegal. It's not illegal, right? It's
Nope.
not against the law.
Which
Uh,
is what they're pointing out with the U.S. new states that are becoming these tax havens. They're working with the politicians, the policymakers, with these lobbyists from these corporate interests, these corporations, these companies, these powerful people, and they're making sure this is legal, so they don't get in trouble. So they're making sure they're lobbying these politicians, these lawmakers, to make sure it's technically legal. So I think that's another that's important thing to point out. You're pointing out there's
yeah,
technically this shit wasn't illegal.
yeah, and it's not illegal, or I should say it's legal because it serves the interests of
Hmm.
the ruling class. Like this is the reason they set up a capitalist system, is so that they can do things like this, knowing full well that they have the capability of doing that, of hiding their money, whereas folks without the resources, without the wealth, can't do that. But getting into specific individuals in Latin America, I'll start with some of the big names that kind of came out. The
Hmm.
first one being, again, we mentioned him before, Guillermo Lasso from Ecuador, one of the wealthy businessmen, former, I believe, like a banker. And so it's no surprise here. His name is on there. The
Luis
Chilean,
Sabina,
right,
the Dominican Republic president
yeah,
as well, right?
the Dominican president, right, current Dominican Republic
Hmm.
president Abinader, the Chilean president Sebastian Piñera, who is, I think, the richest man in the country. And so a lot of these names are kind of like not surprising. I mean, these are some of
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
in their respective countries. One thing I will say about Abinader is that uh, in Dominican politics, oftentimes the political parties are more centrist liberal, or just liberal, and so it's very hypocritical for them to on the one hand come out and talk about inequality or corruption or this and that. And this is another thing that got pointed out in through many of the reports. A lot of these presidents, a lot of these leaders are constantly talking about corruption, talking about stopping offshore tax havens and this and that. Meanwhile, they are participating in that very same
Hmm.
practice, right? And it's no surprise the liberals and the conservatives at the end of the day are both capitalists, right? They're both going to be working within the same system, doing essentially the same things, using different tactics. Um, so what's your thoughts on some of those names, or any other names that you've seen that really stand out?
So as far as like Latin America, it wasn't a surprise, as you're saying, and who they named, because it's the same countries that are the allies of the U.S. in Latin America. Um,
Hmm.
Also interesting. It's not a politician, just kind of random, which they also kind of did in these papers.
Yeah,
They're like, oh, Shakira has an offshore account, so they named a Latin musician. That was kind of random. Um, Kind of how they threw Tony Blair under the bus. It was just kind of weird on that part. And then they, I think it was the president of Kenya as well, outside of Latin America. And as you were saying, these politicians like the ones in Latin America are talking about, hey, we're against these offshore accounts, we're against these issues, but then they're hypocritical, typical of politicians and capitalists. They're doing the exact thing they're saying that people shouldn't do. And when I was reading this, the Kenyan president was also kind of doing the same thing, and when he's talking and politicking, he was saying the same thing, that we're against these offshore accounts. No, something specific to Africa. I can't remember exactly what it was he was talking about, but he was doing the same thing. And then but then here he is also participating in these schemes.
Right. And I think, it's not, again, it's not surprising because a lot of these countries, what are they? They're neo colonies, right? They're neo colonies, and they're still run by a comprador bourgeois who's just serving the international imperialist interest. So at the end of the day, the domestic bourgeoisie within these countries are just being capitalist and funneling that money back to, capitalists and imperialists here in the United States and the UK and et cetera, in all the Western countries. And it's fairly obvious. This is just showing exactly how it works. Um, but it
And
is interesting.
they also mentioned like Putin,
Oh
but it
yeah,
was kind of like they just kind of threw it in there, like, oh, by the way, Putin, this one lady that had a
right,
child with him, bought this one house offshore. It's kind of like, oh, we got to throw a jab at Putin too.
right. And it's interesting because with Putin, I saw, like, if you look at all the pictures and they're basically using it as propaganda. They have Putin's face on there, but Putin is never directly
Yeah, they
mentioned.
like talk about him in like
Yeah,
two sentences, like, and it's like people that
right,
are. It's not even him. It's just people that are like associated with him. But then they put him. Yeah, like I saw that too and all that. But they're obviously gonna push their propaganda,
right.
and that's just not to say that there's corruption over there, but like it's just funny how, oh, we got to throw Putin's face on there, even though he's really not a part of this leak.
Right.
Besides a couple mentions.
Right. And that really kind of exposes, at least in my opinion, the political bias of
Hmm.
these leaks. Like, it's clear once you start doing shit like that, it's like, well, what angle are you going for? Is this really about, journalistic integrity and exposing people who are doing something wrong, or is this a political attack or maneuver against certain individuals? And we have, so just going down to some of the comments too. We have Carlos talking about this was another a few actually individuals from Colombia were also
Yeah.
implicated in this in the leaks. And again, it really, what it exposed was the hypocrisy of many of these individuals who, on the one hand, want to talk about corruption being so bad. In fact, many of these individuals, especially in Latin America, corruption is blamed as, one of the leading causes of destroying governments, right, without any kind of further critical analysis. And in reality, the people who are blaming corruption for the issues in Latin America are oftentimes the ones who are at the root of the corruption. um, with the exception of some social democrats and some socialist leaders, the reality is that a lot of these liberals and conservatives are doing the thing that they claim to be fighting against. And that was exposed here, right? That was shown. I think what's also really important is to look at just how much money is being trickled or taken out of these nations, because that's really wealth that could be going to, developing the countries. The
Hmm.
$14 million that, Piñera from Chile was, putting in assets for his sons, or for the corporation that they were putting money in, offshore. That money could have gone to actually developing Chile, right? And it's the same is true for every leader and every millionaire or billionaire who's funneling money out of the country. That could easily have gone to welfare programs, food programs, housing programs, things that could actually be seriously beneficial, especially during the pandemic and the
Hmm.
current recession. So, any thoughts on that?
Um, it just shows how these politicians work, especially when they're just there to serve U.S. interests most of the time. These specific politicians that are named here, And then they also mention, a lot of some of this stuff is very recent, obviously, but they even went back as to like the 90s and the 70s with these documents, which I thought was interesting too. So it kind of just shows the longevity of how this corruption of these of, I guess, modern, because it went back to the 70s, but it kind of seems like a lot of this stuff comes from the 90s and later. So it's kind of during this neoliberal era too, as well. The way this is working and the way these documents go back to, because it goes back to the 70s, but I guess the majority of it was 90s and until now. So
Right.
so there's a lot of stuff that's just goes back decades, and that just shows how this has been, this corruption's been going on forever. But
Right.
they talk about how some of these, it's generational, keeps going, and it kind of breaks in the original article. It breaks down like how these trusts work and how they have three different little parties that work in creating these trusts.
Mhm.
And it's also the same way, like over here in California with Newsom, he owns a winery, I
Yep.
guess, like a wine company, right? But since he's the governor, he had to put it in one of those blind trusts. So it reminded me of that too. Like, so, oh yeah, he's not involved, but really he is. He's accumulating money, and when he's done being the governor, he's gonna go back to it, right? So
Right.
it kind of brought that up too for me as someone who lives here in California. But
Right. And that really goes back to like there are like mechanisms in place
mm-hmm,
for them to do this legally. Like they've built that into the system. They've built that into the law. They've built it into the capitalist, economy where this is all legal. And so, for a lot of these rich folks, I mean, I guarantee a lot of them, they're not really too concerned about these leaks because it's like, well, I've done nothing wrong. Um, and that kind of brings me to the next part I want to talk about is a lot of I've seen multiple from Pakistan to Mexico with AMLO. Many leaders and presidents come out and say, well, we're going to try to take punishment, or we're going to try to take action to punish some of those individuals named in the leaks. Um, and I find this, I think it's an interesting tactic. It's an interesting strategy. I'm not sure how successful it'll be, only because, like we've been saying, a lot of what they're doing isn't necessarily illegal. Um,
mm-hmm.
but it is interesting to see some leaders kind of take a very hard stance against the, the corruption, really, the moving of this money. What are your thoughts on that?
So as you mentioned, Mexico, AMLO said something about it.
Yeah.
There was a root because there was, I guess, 3,000 Mexicans named in the files.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so he mentioned that. So it's interesting which, I guess, governments and leaders are, opposing this, talking about it, being critical of these papers. Because I don't think I saw Biden say anything about this,
Yeah.
right?
I don't think so. I haven't.
Yeah.
Not sure.
And
Uh,
I thought it was also interesting. Okay, like with not going off this, not to go off your question, but
yeah. Go ahead.
when we mentioned the Dominican president, uh, in our little private chats, there was a tweet that we found of like the Dominican Republic praising a U.S. official that works for the U.S. aid department aid. One of those. What was her name?
Yeah.
That lady Powers.
Samantha Powers.
Yeah, and thought that was interesting that that tweet happened and these leaks come out.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so just praising someone they work with, it's obviously one of those, NGOs that the U.S. government agency that works with the CIA. So,
Right. Right. And it's important to take note of that because this is uh, again, it really shows how these systems work, and it also exposes at the same time that the U.S. is very deeply connected in part of how the U.S. provides power and support to many of these leaders is through these subtle ways and subtle sort of maneuvers. So you have the NGOs, you have the
mhm.
financial yeah, like the offshore accounts, and so the financial capital essentially taking telling these leaders that, look, if you give us some of your money, we'll be able to store it for you for your future or whatever, for your children, for generations to come, et cetera, right? Basically building wealth for these individuals who collaborate with the United States, right? And that's the key, is that you have to be a collaborator, an imperialist collaborator, in order to gain access to certain benefits and privileges, like, having these offshore accounts in South Dakota, or having access to lawyers, or et cetera, all these things. So it really, it really kind of like exposes that. But just on the thing, on the part of like the going after a lot of these individuals, I think
Mm-hmm.
it'll be interesting to see if certain governments really do pursue like some sort of, I don't know, criminal action, or some sort of, I don't know, like lawsuit maybe against some of these individuals who are involved in these offshore accounts. I don't really know what they would even go after them for, because again, it may be corruption, maybe lying, but who knows? A lot of it too has to deal with whether these individuals are going to keep their money now in like
Yeah,
the
I
United
know.
States, or if they're going to
They're
move.
probably just gonna move it somewhere else now.
Right, yeah. So
And then on the topic I brought up, we kind of talked about a little bit how these could be controlled leaks and
yeah,
who are the people sending, dropping these leaks. They're corporate U.S. media usually, like the group that dropped them. They're called like the international. What are they called? The
the
International Consortium of Investigative Journalists.
right, yeah, SCIJ.
So found an article. I guess there was some interesting information on who funds these journalists.
Mm,
And usually it was funny because it's one of those, Soros, the billionaire that the right wingers like to talk about all the time in conspiracies.
yeah,
But he was one of them. George Soros, the Ford Foundation. So even the people funding is kind of interesting. Like, okay, the Ford Foundation, who's worked with the U.S. government, CIA, and a lot of things, it's kind of interesting how they're also the ones funding this group that dropped these leaks.
yeah, yeah. And the Ford Foundation, I've done some research into them and looked into them. The Ford Foundation is an interesting organization because they fund a lot of progressive and a lot of sort of
Hmm.
very liberal movements and organizations, and so it's always interesting to look to see who they provide support for.
And then the
Um,
right wing always goes very crazy with Soros on their conspiracies,
right,
even
yeah,
though he is helping provide funding for all this stuff. It just kind of they always just tend to go to him for some reason.
right. Well, he's another billionaire capitalist,
Yeah, yeah,
and their attacks on Soros are just kind of, to me, they're very irrelevant, because it's sort of billionaire capitalists fighting amongst themselves,
yep, yep.
using these, middle class and working class Republicans and liberals to do the hard work and do the groundwork for them. But it's this, it's a capitalist class fighting amongst each other.
Hmm.
But that's, it's always interesting
They're
to look at.
fighting amongst each other, but they're still making money. So,
Right, right. And they're both essentially using the same means,
yep,
doing
yep.
the same thing. So it's really very little difference. But it's so one other thing too I want to bring up is it's been shown that there's not only current presidents who are implicated in this leak, but there's also several. I think they said about 11 former Latin American presidents
Okay.
are also implicated in the leak. So again, we have we're seeing the corruption from not like ministers or just any regular everyday politicians, but from the very top of the
Yeah,
leadership.
the ones that the ones with the true power, I guess.
Right, right. And the ones who also, and I think it's also important to note not only who was in the leaks, but also who was not in the leaks. And what we've seen is, there were no, at least I didn't see, correct me if I'm wrong, any like Cuban
Nope.
socialist politicians in the leagues, right? I didn't see anyone from, or at least I don't know anyone from the PSUV or the PCV who was in the leaks. Um, a
They
lot
didn't.
of,
There was nothing to do with the Communist Party of China. They mentioned like some Chinese like investor billionaires, probably some
right,
Chinese capitalists, but they didn't even mention who they were. It's kind of just they just kind of threw it in there, kind of
Right.
like the Putin thing.
Right. Right. So notice that there's no like anti-imperialist or I really don't, I didn't see any at least. Very few anti-imperialists, very few, socialist or social democratic leaders who are part of the pink tide or the red tide, whatever you want to refer to it as. There were, very few of these, actually socialist leaders implicated in these revelations. And in fact, the majority of the people seem to be like right wing
Hmm.
billionaires from across the globe. And I think that's important to look at too, who was not implicated in these, because it shows that they actually believe what they say, right? We actually believe in ending corruption. They actually have the value of being anti-capitalist and not doing these, not having these offshore accounts or things like that, because they see it as being inherently wrong.
Yeah, and knowing who funded these journalists who provided these leaks, if they didn't, if they found something on these socialist leaders, they would have obviously dropped it because they'd want to,
Right.
because they
Absolutely.
hate socialism, they hate communism. Like they would totally drop it. So I
Right.
think that's interesting to point out. Like they couldn't. If they did, they would have dropped. They would have said something about it. So they didn't. So that means they didn't find anything.
Right. Right. Exactly right. Like they that's the thing to me. I was worried when it first came out. I was thinking, oh man, this is going to be. I wonder if they're going to use this to attack,
Hmm.
China, or if they're going to use it to attack Venezuela or whatever. And as soon as it came out, it was no, almost. At least I didn't see any Chinese party members. I didn't, or
Hmm.
Chinese Communist Party members. I didn't see any PSUV members. It was all people like, yeah, oh yeah, this guy who's already a billionaire. No surprise, he's storing money somewhere else. And I think that's important. That's really important to point out, because it really shows that the folks who we've consistently supported on this program, I'm sure you've consistently supported on your program, are not actually or not that they're not, they are actually believe in what they say, right? And they do want to make a better world where people pay their fair share, where people actually redistribute their wealth and don't just store it in these offshore accounts where they just raise more and more money just out of greed. um I think that's important. It's really important. But so I don't know, any do you have any final words on the Pandora papers, the leaks, or what, like the impact
Um,
that's been had?
I I think these are always important, even if I said like, okay, look who funded these journalists who leaked it, and there's going to be an agenda as well, but I still feel they're important. And then I think the big takeaway is what we just talked about is we didn't find any leaders from the socialist Latin American and global South countries implicated in these papers, because if they found something on them, they would have said shit.
Right.
So I think that's probably the most important thing that I took away from it. And then as also the what we talked about with South Dakota and Nevada becoming these offshore havens in the U.S.
Right. Right. And I think that the South Dakota Nevada thing shows that the U.S. right now under Biden will rail and rant against big corporations, but they'll be more than happy to take in all of this offshore money that's being probably laundered and gotten through fraud or whatever sort of dirty means. They'll be happy, more than happy, to take all of that into the banks here in the U.S.
And
Right.
then I wonder if other very right wing government states in the U.S. will maybe start doing this too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would argue they already have.
Yeah, but we don't know
Right.
about it.
Right. Or just look at like look at what some of these states do in order to bring in. I guess this is more like domestic U.S. politics, but like look at what some of these states do to try to attract people, like Texas. You
Oh
know,
yeah, mhm.
lowering what is it, how property taxes, uh, having very cheap rent, and et cetera, et cetera. But in doing that, what happens? Well, the cost of electricity and public services and utilities shoots up significantly because they have really shitty public utilities.
And then we see what happens when they had that storm
Right.
and they had the issues with the electricity and the power going out.
Right. So it's they do these little loopholes and financial things to attract
It's
people.
just
And
like these offshore accounts, but something different. But
right,
they're all, it's all the same goal.
right, right. And so yeah, that's mostly been the Pandora Papers. And I think the last thing I want to kind of mention to talk about the Pandora Papers, just the last point, is with the Panama Papers. And I think it's important to bring up the comparisons between the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers. But with the Panama Papers, the woman who originally leaked those papers was murdered. She was killed in a car bomb. And with the Pandora Papers, I can't imagine, given two things. Given one, that this was mostly an attack again. This is mostly exposing, I should say, uh, people outside of the United States. And two, that this was mostly done by like a very large body of mainstream media sources, the ICIJ, along with like the Washington Post and all these different Western media
Hmm.
sources. Um, I don't think that you'll ever see an attack like this against any of these journalists for the Pandora Papers. Whereas the Panama Papers was done in like very independently by a small group of individuals, and this one woman in particular, who was then murdered, right? So I think that also unfortunately goes to show just how impactful the Panama Papers were versus the Pandora Papers, in really like exposing some of the crimes that folks have been some have been engaging in. But that's my last. That's really the last thing I had to say about the Pandora Papers. We'll sort of. We'll go into some of the headlines for this last
Okay.
2 weeks, I guess. Um, we're gonna see if Victor is gonna join us in a bit, but we'll start with some of the basic headlines. So, starting in Nicaragua, the Sandinista government of Nicaragua has authorized two Cuban-made coronavirus vaccines. 7 million Cuban vaccines will be received in Nicaragua. And Venezuela, Vietnam, and Iran have also authorized the use of Cuban coronavirus vaccines. And this all comes right after the Cuban government has went to the WHO to try to get approval for their vaccines, which have been shown to be, well over 90%
Yeah,
effective.
they're just as effective as the US based vaccines.
Right. Right. So, you have any thoughts about those headlines? Or
So it's just another example of Cuba helping Latin America, being an example of, you know, being an example for other socialist, communist nations and the way they prioritize public health, not just in Cuba, but throughout Latin America.
right,
Because here they are again, they're going to provide vaccines to help out their friends.
right. And I always
Whereas
say,
the U.S. like Pfizer or Moderna and them don't want to distribute their medicine, their vaccine across. They want to make money
right,
off it.
right. And we see these corporations literally trying to vie to make as much money off of it as possible. Um, but like I always say, if you want to see a great example of international solidarity, especially international working class solidarity, look at what Cuba is doing, and look at what Cuba has historically done. That's probably the greatest example of international solidarity from almost any socialist country in history, I would argue. Um, and the fact that they're giving these vaccines to countries, and they're doing more to help nations that are in need, as a
Hmm.
nation that is under a blockade and can't even
Yeah, under
access.
a blockade, just like them, and they're still able to
Right,
help out these
right,
other countries in need.
right, and do more than nations that are 10 times richer than them, like the United States or the UK or France. It's pretty
And
amazing.
Venezuela is one of the countries that's right now one of the key targets of U.S. CIA like geopolitical interests. They want to they've been trying to install their own government in there.
Right,
So it's very important, I think, that Cuba is helping the people of Venezuela as they usually do.
right. And same with Nicaragua. Nicaragua has
Hmm.
elections coming up soon, and so it's important that they actually really get these vaccines, and get the population uh, ready for the elections. Get the population in support of, or I should say, against what's going to be the imperialist attacks that are going to be coming very soon against Nicaragua, which have really been, we've been covering them here on this program a lot, but it's going to start ramping up to intense degrees as the election gets closer and closer.
Yeah, and we've had that history with the U.S. and Nicaragua, and trying to fuck with us with the government, with
Right.
the socialist people of Nicaragua. So
Right. So going on to the next headline, which kind of deals with the upcoming elections in Nicaragua. There's a an act in the U.S. Congress which has been around for past couple months. It's called the Renacer Act. In HR 2946, if you're going to look it up. So it's a bill right now, and it's in the U.S. Congress. Basically, the bill is there to quote promote democracy in Nicaragua. So the bill restricts aid to Nicaragua from any international financial institution. It also allows the U.S. to sanction any member of the FSLN, family members of party members, or government officials, or state security forces and Supreme Court members. At the same time that this bill is being debated in the U.S. Congress, or at least uh, oftentimes these bills don't get debated, they just get passed unanimously. But as this bill is waiting in the U.S. Congress, there was a joint declaration statement from countries Canada, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, France, and the U.S. and UK, basically saying that they doubt the validity and legitimacy of the upcoming elections, November elections in Nicaragua. So this is what we're talking about when we mention like
mhm.
this all-out assault against Nicaraguan elections coming. It's really not
it's
coming; it's already
it's
happening.
already here. Yeah, and
Yeah,
then the elections are in a month, less than a month.
right, right. And so this is important to. It's important to follow these things, especially the Renacer Act, which has been going on. It's been in Congress for months now, and like I said earlier, a lot of these acts get passed unanimously without a vote.
Hmm.
But these are the bills that essentially are placing sanctions on individuals or restricting aid by basically by saying like the IMF or the World Bank cannot give any loans or cannot give any aid to these nations, or else they'll get sanctioned. Or any bank in the world cannot give any sort of loans or take any money from any individuals part of the FSLN, or else they'll get sanctioned. Right. So these are the attacks against these countries that we have to be aware of and be on the lookout for, because they really do serious damage, right? We've seen 2019 the sanctions against Venezuela killed 40,000 Venezuelans. Um, so do you have any more or any other ideas on that headline?
Well, it just shows, I guess, the importance of Nicaragua, because here the U.S. and their allies are trying to, you know, place sanctions on them, mess with them as usual for their interests. But as we talked about the story earlier, with Cuba providing public health aid to Nicaragua, and it, like we're saying, this election's coming up, so it just shows how important right now Nicaragua is
Right,
in what's going to be happening in terms of geopolitics in Latin America. Um, so it's something that people need to pay attention to in the coming weeks.
right. So let's go on to the next headline on Cuba. So in Cuba, we have 80% of the Cuban population is received at least one dose or one shot of a three-dose vaccination program. Roughly 50% of the population is fully vaccinated. Cuba uh, is striving its to fully vaccinate its population using their own homegrown vaccines. And by comparison, China has fully vaccinated about 80% of its population, also
Okay.
using its own vaccine. And the Cuban biochemistry company BioCuba Pharma has produced enough shots to fully vaccinate the entire country of Cuba. So, any thoughts on that headline?
So just shows how people in Cuba trust science.
Mhm.
Where here in the US, we're still having this debate. We're in over 2 years into this pandemic. We've had a vaccine for almost a year now, and the rates are not consistent. People aren't, there's still issues with people getting vaccinated. here in the U.S., even though we have the resources to get vaccinated. But here's Cuba, having all these sanctions for decades against them from the U.S. and their allies. They're still able to produce this vaccine. Their people already 50% fully vaccinated. And I think it's also interesting that they have a 3 vaccine little program. So you're going to get 3 shots. So I'm assuming a booster shot that kind of works like the U.S. vaccines. And here in the U.S., we just approved sort of to get boosters, right? But it's still kind of like a debate.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So Pfizer is trying to basically push the FDA to approve the booster vaccine. I think that's partially like a money thing. Um, they want to be the first to get the booster vaccine before Moderna, before these other corporations. So I think that's part of the issue that really gets people tripped up. Like like you said, in Cuba, people actually have trust in their science and in their government and in their vaccines.
Yeah, as the comment someone mentioned it, they trust their government. They trust the Cuban government.
Right. And I think I might have shared it with y'all in our chat a while back, but there was a good article, or there was a good work done by Cuban doctors who basically were looking at the anti-vaccine movement and vaccines uh, throughout the world, and really pointing out how the reason why they're so successful in Cuba is because they've built trust between the population and between the Cuban healthcare system and the Cuban government. And the Cuban system, this is just based off of speaking to U.S. Uh, healthcare workers who've gone to Cuba and seen their system firsthand. I remember asking them what was some of the main differences that you saw. And in Cuba, one of the things they pointed out was that they have a system of preventative care. So they have a clinical system, which basically is a bunch of small clinics spread throughout the country with a lot of doctors who are going to be almost individually caring for each person. Whereas our system is sort of an emergency room or a hospital system. So we wait until people actually get ill or get sick or get hurt or get injured, and then we treat them. Whereas in Cuba, they're going to try to treat individuals or treat their citizens before they get ill, before they get sick. It's that preventative care before you have a serious emergency or a serious illness or a serious disease. And I think that's really important in terms of how their healthcare system is working right now in COVID. It's trying to prevent the spread of the disease rather than trying to treat it after it's been spread.
Yeah, because U.S. companies just care about making money, and that's what leads to the mistrust of vaccines as well. Because people are well aware, even right wingers are well aware of how pharmaceutical companies are corrupt, and just care about profit. And so that is one other reason why a lot of these people in the U.S. are also very skeptical of a vaccine.
Right.
Whereas in Cuba, it's not about profit; it's about just helping their people stay healthy.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's not about profit. It's about preventing the diseases from spreading in the first place. And it's partially why Cuba has one of the best virology centers in the world, because they figured that would be a key way to prevent medicine. And Fidel Castro put a lot of effort into developing the virology of Cuba in order to stop diseases before they spread, out of control. And that really is important, especially for countries that are, especially when we think about countries in the global south. Like some of the diseases that they're facing are diseases that we've wiped out, like, or we don't have to like be as concerned with, like malaria or even polio. Recently, I think they said something about a potential malaria vaccine, and I think that would be, as people who look a lot to the global south, I think that would be amazing. Um, that would be incredible, because that would help billions of people across the world. And it's something we don't think about too much here in the U.S., except for recently. But that would be an amazing development. So, going to the next headline about Cuba, we have from Orinoco Tribune. Shout out to them.
Damn cat.
Cuba Cuba remembers the victims of the terrorist bombing of Cubana Airline Flight 455, which took place on the October 6, 1976, about 45 years ago. In the bombing, 73 people were killed. The flight departed from Guyana, destined for Havana, and the counter-revolutionary terrorists were who actually did the bombing were later harbored by the United States. Both were implicated in the bombing. Their names were Luis Posada Cariles and Orlando Bosch. The Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations, an organization founded by Luis Posada Cariles, is considered to be the responsible actor behind the bombing. Both men worked for and with the CIA, and they were both harbored by the U.S., given amnesty and freedom. And they lived in Florida, and they died in Florida as free men. So they never went to prison for the bombings or for the killings of 73 Cubans. Um, so your thoughts on the headline, or
I think that's just something important to point out in history and how the U.S. has used, gusanos against Cuba, and this is one of those historic, tragic moments. And I believe there's a documentary I've seen on this. I can't remember the name right now, but it's maybe like 10 years old,
uh,
talking about this. If I find the name of it, I could tweet it out. But
yeah,
I think it's just important to point this out, and that Cuba, isn't going to forget about that.
right, right. And I remember in Cuba they have a whole museum dedicated to crimes that the CIA has committed against Cubans. And they ranged. It's a very emotional museum. They have, as soon as you walk in, the first thing you see is crosses of every Cuban who has been killed by a
Okay.
CIA operation, and there's hundreds. Um, and so it ranges from everything from biological warfare to kidnapping of children using propaganda to killing of teachers and
Okay.
who are in the literacy program. There's a history of these sorts of atrocities that Cuba has had to face at the hands of the CIA. Um, and it's important to, like you said, it's important to remember them. It's important for history to acknowledge them, because oftentimes when you talk to those people who are very anti-Cuba, they can't name you a single atrocity that the U.S. has
Yeah,
committed
no.
against Cuba, right? They can't name a single atrocity, but they'll name every atrocity that Castro or Che they think committed it
Yeah, they're like,
in
oh, they did a fire squad, they killed all these
yeah,
people. And I'm like, if they killed anybody, it was the rich, corrupt elite
right,
people.
right. And they can't even tell you at all about any of the CIA atrocities. So it's crazy, but yeah, it is important to keep these in mind and keep these
And
anniversaries.
we got those stupid organizations like Victims of Communism spreading that
Right?
bullshit.
Yeah, right. Uh, it would be interesting. What if there was a victims of capitalism? There are many countries in the world that have whole museums dedicated to that.
Yeah, like you just said, Cuba.
Right. And
Which
there
one
was
day when I finally go there, I'm gonna check that out.
yeah, no, you got to check Museo del Renuncio, great
Okay.
museum. And they have, it's funny, I went there, I saw that museum, and this is a real quick anecdote. I went there, saw that museum, and then I think a few months later I went to Vietnam, and they had
Okay.
almost the exact same museum, a museum dedicated to the U.S. atrocities in the country. Like, it's awful to think about and to see as well. The only part that made it worse was to hear U.S. Citizens or individuals who I went on this program with say, well, that museum is just full of propaganda, so it's not really. Don't believe everything you see in it. It's ridiculous to just say that the real life atrocities that people faced were just propaganda, but that's the American mindset.
Someone in the comments said that there's a black book of capitalism.
Yeah, there should be. I mean, you should absolutely be. You should check it out at least. But so going on to the next headline. This is so shifting from Cuba to Puerto Rico, or I'm sorry, shifting from Cuba to Mexico. In Mexico, the Mexico and U.S. officials met on Friday to discuss new ways to fight drug trafficking and drug cartels in the region. The bicentennial framework is the name given to this new joint effort, pledging to fight the root causes of violence and drug addiction. The new framework essentially places the Merida Initiative and security migration are at the core of the relationship between the two countries. Essentially, the U.S. is willing to continue to provide financial aid to Mexico in return for cooperation on the immigration issue. Mexico is also making demands that the U.S. take responsibilities for weapons trafficking to drug cartels in Mexico. So thoughts?
This is very interesting to see how this continues, how Mexico relies on the US for money. And so they make these deals. Okay, we'll sacrifice this issue that you want to, obviously the US is worried about immigration. But then it's interesting how Mexico is also saying, hey, well, we're making demands that you take responsibility for the weapons trafficking into Mexico. Which I thought that's interesting that they pointed that out, because the U.S. produces so many weapons and guns, and we know that's usually where a lot of them come from. So but it's also interesting how this relationship kind of works, because Mexico will be critical of the U.S. in some instances, but then will not be. They're obviously neighbors, but they have this relationship, and Mexico's here showing they're still dependent on some money from the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The U.S., the U.S. I think historically always looks to Mexico to try to solve, or recently specifically has looked to Mexico to try to solve its immigration issue. They had that. What was that policy? Stay in Mexico, or don't come here, something like that. These policies that I think are there are ways to, the way I see it, there are ways to deport people without actually deporting people. You're just taking an advanced step where you're preventing them from even getting in the country by working with another government to say, look, we'll just keep you here. People don't want to, people aren't trying to flee from their countries to Mexico. Let's be real. They're trying to flee to the United States because they recognize the United States has more opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So
Sorry to interrupt, but the U.S. also always pressures Mexico to secure their border with Central America,
right?
Because a lot of the immigration is coming from Central America, because the U.S. destabilized their countries, and so there's always that tension too.
Right, and the U.S. and it's important because Mexico is not stealing. It's not like the imperialist power. It's not the imperialist power here. It's not stealing money from Guatemala or El Salvador or any other nation in Latin America to the extent that the U.S. is, right? The U.S. is taking, is an imperialist power. Mexico simply is not an imperialist power in that same way.
And if they were an imperialist power, they wouldn't be borrowing money from the United States.
Be borrowing from the United States. Yeah. And so, they can't. What's going to happen is it's going to put a burden on Mexico to care for immigrants, or not even migrants, who they can't care for and who they had no role in displacing in the first place, right? Whereas the U.S. did have a role in doing that. And so, it's going to be, if Mexico does go through with it, I think it's going to be pretty difficult on them economically. You're absolutely right, though, that it is interesting to see them push back against the weapons trafficking that goes on all the time.
Yeah, because of course Mexico has the narco issue, but the U.S. never admits, well, who's the one buying all the drugs that are the narcos? It's the U.S. The U.S. wants the drugs.
Yeah,
like, people do drugs all over the world, but the U.S. is the biggest consumption of it. So it's like,
right.
It's Mexico is calling them out, like, hey, and then you're providing the weapons. And we already know the U.S. has a history of providing weapons to other countries as well, and organizations.
Right. And they have there's that ongoing lawsuit that Mexico filed against the United States, basically claiming that the U.S. is knowingly selling weapons to these cartels.
Oh, yeah.
And it's funny. The lawsuit says they're even pandering to Mexicans by making weapons like pistols with Emiliano Zapata engraved, his face engraved on the pistols, in order to sort of pander to like the drug cartel's audience or the Mexican audience or whatever it might be.
So they're marking this product. They're using Zapata's image to market to the cartels. Hey, you want to get this gun with Zapata's face on it? You can feel like Zapata using it.
Right. It's crazy. It's crazy, but that's what they're doing. And I think Mexico's doing the right thing in calling them out. But going on to the next issue, to the next headline. So AMLO will reject any bills proposed to privatize the nation's lithium resources, stating that lithium should be developed exclusively by the government and belongs to the state of Mexico. So any thoughts, any comments on that one?
That's interesting, especially how we know, someone like Elon Musk made that tweet not too long ago when it comes to lithium in Africa, I believe.
Right.
Or
in Bolivia.
So it wasn't Latin America, it was Bolivia, because it was during the coup, I believe, when he was talking about, we'll just do a coup on anyone if we want. And so I think it's interesting. This is a good thing, obviously, if he's rejecting any bills to privatize the lithium resources, because that's what, lithium is probably one of the most important resources right now in the world, because it's a battery, it helps your phones, all these other things, right? So a lot of the tech companies rely on these resources. So it's a good thing that he's saying, hey, we're not going to privatize our lithium.
Right. And it's good that he's taking that stance.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have so Victor joined us just in time for the headlines. How you doing, Victor?
Greetings. How's everybody doing?
Pretty good, man.
All right.
What's up, Victor?
I'm all right, man. Just trying to battle these allergies. I get allergies between the seasons, and so I was all messed up yesterday. I'm a little bit better today, but still trying to battle these allergies. Nick, did you want? Hey, to the folks out there checking us out. Shout out to the audience. Nick, did you want me to continue with the next headline?
Yeah, the next one I was gonna do was the one, I think Miguel sent this one.
Yeah.
AMLO with the Israeli prime minister.
Yeah. All right,
so
I'll pick up there. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, publicly stated that he is waiting word from the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett over the requested extradition of Thomas Zedong, stating that Israel cannot be a refuge for torturers. Thomas Zedong is a former Mexican official accused of torture and evidence tampering. In 2014, 43 students were kidnapped, presumed to be massacred, and remains disappeared. Thomas Zedong is accused of being involved in this tragedy. This piece, Miguel, you submitted this one. Your response to that.
So I had no idea about this connection with Israel on this. So when I found it this morning, I thought it was pretty interesting, especially with AMLO pretty much calling out Israel to, hey, extradite this torturer to our country. And I find it interesting as well because, Mexico and the U.S. have this relationship, but then, we all know about the U.S. and Israeli relationship. So I thought that was interesting too, how he's calling out a big U.S. ally on this as well.
Yeah, he was essentially Thomas Zedong essentially was like the equivalent to like the FBI director over there in Mexico. So he's implicated in this stuff. Of course, he denies the charges, and similar to Nick, I know you mentioned before Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carriles, who were known terrorists. I mean, these were known terrorists. They got to live out their lives out in Florida, instead of in a prison, right? Instead of a jail cell. So this guy. So it's. I bring that up only because what do they say? Someone's terrorist is someone else's freedom fighter or whatever. So it's just fascinating. Now you have a leftist president I guess we could argue whether he's really leftist, but I would say he's a leftist president in AMLO in Mexico, and you have a Zionist government over there in Israel. So we'll see what happens. Do they extradite this man and do the right thing, or do they just continue to do what the Western world has done in the past, which is give these people amnesty and just and refuge, right? Not amnesty, but refuge.
Right.
Any other thoughts on that before we go to the next headline? No. All right. So AMLO offered it. Next headline is that AMLO offered an apology to the Yaqui indigenous people for crimes committed by the state against their ancestors. He said the government is committed to a justice plan. That's how it's being described, as to a justice plan of giving the Yaqui people back their land, or their land back, guaranteeing them water rights, and establishing a comprehensive social welfare program. The crimes were committed under Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz between 1884 to 1911. Yaqui spokesperson Jesus Patricio Varela said the following in response to AMLO: "The justice plan is not a gift. It's not welfare. It seeks to give us back what is ours. Territory that has been taken from us, the water that has been limited to us, the dignity that they wanted to steal from us." You've seen this. You've seen AMLO pay a lot of lip service to this type of stuff before, and it's good. I don't mean that as something disrespectful. I think this is the right thing to do, and I find it interesting that he continues on with that trajectory. Your response, Miguel or Nick?
Well, it just shows how even Mexico and AMLO is willing to, I guess, give land back to some of the indigenous people, whereas in the U.S. we don't do that. They don't do that. So I thought that's also important to point out, just how anti-indigenous the U.S. is, and Mexico has that history as well. But to even do this and suggest this, and to actually talk with the Yaqui people about this and saying, "Hey, we're going to give you the land back," it's important. So let's see. Hopefully, he does that. This actually goes through.
Absolutely. The next headline points to the contradictions of AMLO. And so the Maya Train Project, an AMLO multi-billion-dollar project, which sets to construct railroad that would stretch hundreds of miles in the Yucatan Peninsula and in Chiapas, is being protested by activists in defense of indigenous groups, which would be affected by the project. The piece that we read cited that this is something that AMLO is doing essentially for Western tourists. Look, I haven't read much about this. The first time I read about this, so I'd be curious to see what happens. I'll stop there and I'll wait for your response. But I think this points to some of the contradictions of AMLO.
Yeah, which I found this morning. I just heard about it today too, from just looking for news sources. But as you say, this is also pointing to the contradiction, because our last headline, we're like, hey, AMLO's, I'm gonna do this justice plan. I'm gonna give this land back to the Yaqui people here in the north. But then we have here this issue in southern Mexico, pretty much in like Chiapas, with this project that's really just going to be catered to U.S., to Westerners, to tourism, to capitalism. So I thought it was important to point out these contradictions with these two articles. So it's something interesting to follow, and I guess they're going to be, I think it's October 12th, the article said, they're going to have a conference or something.
Yeah. Rafael Correa, former president of Ecuador, faced similar challenges in his country. So did former President Lula da Silva in Brazil, where you're trying to develop a nation, right? You're trying to focus on economic development and try to bring people out of poverty. And at the same time, you have to be sensitive to the indigenous communities, right? And their position and their claims and their grievances. And so it's a tough juggling act, for these leftists. I'm not trying to make an excuse either. I'm just saying that that's a reality. These are realities that Latin American leftists, leaders have to contend with.
And in China, they've had these similar projects when it comes to these high-speed rail trains. So I wonder if Mexico could look towards that as an example and how they dealt with that.
Absolutely. Moving on to Haiti. Haiti's general election has been postponed. Prime Minister Ariel Henry dismissed the council responsible for organizing elections. So they had a specific council. I think it was a nine-member council. And so he dissolved it. And he's appointing a new electoral council. And at the same time, they're getting, Haiti's getting pressure from the UN Security Council to have elections as soon as possible. It's again, just, every time we read news about Haiti, it seems to never be, I hate to say this, it just never seems to be good news.
One of the individuals they're propping up right now in Haiti is actually the wife of Moise, who I guess has now finally recovered from the assassination attempt. And now they're, it's interesting. They're propping her up. She's just as corrupt and just as a puppet of the U.S. as much as her husband was. And but she's different. She's a woman, for one. She's a new face, but she's still that same legacy of coming out of that same capitalist class of anti-Aristide politicians. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes with Haiti.
Absolutely. Sticking to news in Haiti, about Haiti, the U.S. has deported close to 4,000 Haitian migrants in a 10-day stretch, refusing them asylum. Most of these individuals lived in a South American nation before entering the United States. And so, and a lot of groups have come out and denounced this move by the U.S., basically just on I guess, a moral and ethic grounds, saying that this is just, considering all the problems that Haiti has had, this is specifically over the last 12 months, then you're doing this to them, right? So again, another headline that it not a good headline, to read out. But your thoughts on that?
Well, Biden was supposed to help all the migrants, I thought.
Yeah, I know. Thought he was supposed to close all the facilities.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I didn't. It's not surprising. Biden and Trump have essentially the same immigration policy, and that went without being said. But now we're seeing in action, it's not even the same policy, really. The Biden policy is worse.
Yeah, Republicans when they campaign, are very they have a very radical position. And what the Democrats tend to do is that they pay lip service to immigration reform, if you will. And it's bullshit. They use the Latino community. They know that they want the Latino vote. And so they use the Latino community. And everyone knows this. And Latinos every 4 years get caught up in, the Democrats are going to do something for us on this issue. And they don't, and they have no intention of doing that. Neither did Obama. Obama was considered, by many, he was given that moniker of the deporter in chief. They don't care. They don't care. They have no intention of helping out the Latino community. Just to say, let's make it a broader thing, and just the overall immigrant community. They have no intention of doing anything seriously trying to tackle this problem. They have no intention of doing that, but they pay lip service. It sounds great on the campaign trail.
Right.
Yep.
Moving on to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has declared a state of emergency over continuous apagones, or electrical power outages. Luma, a private contractor, is in charge of the transmission and distribution of electrical energy on the island, while the Puerto Rico Electrical Power Authority is in charge of controlling power generation units. Over $1 billion has been earmarked by U.S. Congress to upgrade Puerto Rico's power system, and not 1 cent has been dispersed due to pending approval of certain projects. activists have been and will continue to protest the energy crisis. So I use the word apagones. If you've spent time either in the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico, a common thing that you would hear people yell out is "Se fue la luz, se fue la luz," right? So this is just, and this points to Luma being a private contractor. This is what happens when you allow privatization of certain energy industries and certain natural resources, right? And national resources. So this illustrates what happens when you have a private contract. The U.S. Congress is actually pressing, again, I don't know how serious they are, but they're pressing Luma on what's happening over there. And Luma is just, giving very flimsy responses. But your response to this?
Yeah, so, with the whole Luma situation, it's pretty serious. It's been going on for probably about a week now, over a week. They had, for about a 3-day stretch, over 300,000 Puerto Ricans on the island who had no power, right? And that's, consider that the population of the island is only about 3 million. So that's a good chunk of the population with no power. That means that, hospitals had no power. Elderly Puerto Ricans couldn't, their medication couldn't be properly refrigerated. Food couldn't be properly refrigerated. There was a video, I think yesterday I saw, where Puerto Ricans were taking their appliances that they couldn't actually get any electricity for and were throwing them at the gates of the Luma corporation, right? In response, like you said, Victor, what the U.S. Congress has been doing, there was a video too of Rashida Tlaib.
Talib.
Yeah, Talib, who basically was, questioning the Luma executives as to how much money they were making, or like how much money their top executives were making. And for me, I guess a lot of people were praising her, saying that that's good, that she's putting pressure on them, this and that. But like, do we really need to ask how much money the executives are making to really know that they're making too much? Like, do we really need to even start pondering that? Like, what's going to happen? You figure out that they make 500,000. Is that really going to change your feelings towards Luma? No, because you already fucking hate Luma, right? You should already hate Luma. You should already hate the privatization.
It's almost immaterial. Sorry to cut you off. It's almost immaterial to the topic, because even if you want to be real crass about it and you want to be from a capitalist perspective, you just want to know what the fuck is going on. Why aren't people why can't we provide this service, this basic service for the people, regardless of how much the CEO or whatever, the top executives are making. Mm-hmm. So it's almost immaterial. Now you can make a philosophical argument. Well, the fact that they're making so much, they're siphoning the money and the money's not going. Okay, maybe you can put at the core of the question here is that what the hell is going on?
Right.
You want technical answers. You want to know what is going on. Why aren't people getting this basic service? If it's tied to money, okay, then you can look into that. But at the end of the day, it's like, what the fuck's going on?
Right. Because there's also other things too. You got to look at Luma, like the contract. If there's a natural disaster in Puerto Rico, Luma has the right to pull out and not have to deal with the infrastructure problems that are going to come with it. Now, keep in mind, this is Puerto Rico we're talking about. There's a natural disaster every fucking year. There's hurricanes every year, right? So, you're giving these provisions to these corporations. It's not just about the money. It's about what kind of privileges are you giving them to do whatever the hell they want, and which is exactly what's going on. And just, just as a quick shout out, I was at an event the other day with some organizations, some Puerto Rican organizations in New York, Colectiva Solidaridad, G Rebels, and NY Boricua Resistance. Young Puerto Ricans doing really good work out in New York City. So if you're in the area, check them out. Next Friday at 5, for everyone who might be on the East Coast, there's going to be a rally against Luma for Puerto Rico in Union Square. So be on the lookout for that. I'll try to be out there for that one. But this is a serious issue. And
when is that, Nick? When is that protest?
It's at 5 p.m.
on a Friday.
Yeah, October 15th, I think, is next Friday. October 15th. Yeah.
I've seen the flyers for it online.
Yeah, and I'll probably what I'll do is I'll share it again probably on the Anti-Conquista social media, and I'll share it with y'all in our chat. But I'll keep everyone alerted on that, and that's really important if you can make it out to that, because it is true. I just saw Karina's comment here in the chat. It is true. What we're dealing with is colonialism, right? And it's been historically hundreds of years of colonialism, right, against Puerto Rico. And this isn't the only struggle that's rooted in the colonialism of Puerto Rico. I mean, right now you still have, so you have the Luma, the privatization, you have the fiscal promesa, the fiscal control and overview board. You have Hurricane Maria still trying to recover from that. And now you have this issue of disability rights. Something I'm working on right now, actually looking more into, is there's a big Supreme Court case coming up basically saying that Puerto Ricans don't deserve the same rights as other American citizens, that there's a legal right to discriminate against Puerto Ricans because they live on the island. So they can't qualify for disability rights or disability income or anything like that. So it's all these issues that are going on. It's really just legalized discrimination against individuals who are supposed to be U.S. citizens. But that's been the history of Puerto Ricans, man.
Absolutely. Yeah. Shout out to Karina from Telejaguar, who commented, what we are looking at in Puerto Rico, once again, is colonialism unveiled. Never any accountability. And it's a very succinct way of putting it. Again, a reminder to folks, and for folks who don't, if you're not aware, Puerto Rico is the only Spanish-speaking territory that is not a sovereign nation. They're not politically self-governed. They're not recognized as a nation. It's considered a country as a nation, as an idea, right, by Puerto Ricans, but it's not a nation. It's essentially a colonial possession of the U.S. So here we are in 2021 talking about colonies, right? I mean, it's insane, and I've always said that colonialism is slavery's little brother. And so, this is, for all intents and purposes, Puerto Rico is a slave to the U.S. congressman, right? I mean, the U.S. Congress Washington owns Puerto Rico. And there's going to come a time, that situation is just unsustainable. Those contradictions will eventually play out, and there is only one path, and that's independence. That there's just only one path, one path for the Puerto Rican people. Any other thoughts on that before we move on to the next headline? All right, El Salvador. So in El Salvador, we've been reporting on what's been happening with the Bitcoin rollout, and so no surprise, the Bitcoin rollout in El Salvador is still mired by a host of problems. Users are losing money, getting their identity stolen, unable to withdraw funds. And when I say losing money, again, it's kind of like this whole game of one day Bitcoin is worth one amount, the next day it's worth a different amount, and so it's a very precarious situation. And so for folks who are out there in El Salvador investing in this, investing in this, I guess, technology, because it's done on your phone and it's an app, the whole bit. Again, one day you have a certain amount of Bitcoin, and the next day it's a different amount. And so it's just, again, this is not surprising, considering how they fast tracked this and didn't really clearly think this thing through. And I say they, I'm specifically talking about the government of Nayib Bukele. And this has been his big, baby project of, pushing for Bitcoin. Any thoughts on that before we move on to the next headline?
It's not very surprising what's happening, these issues, and it just makes me so angry that this is just essentially some experiment right now in Salvadorians with this cryptocurrency stuff. So just makes me mad because they're just doing this little project, this experiment, and see what happens, and people are getting impacted.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's that's key to point out. This is an experiment, but with people's lives, right? With people's lives on the line. There was an interesting article I saw the other day about cryptocurrency, basically saying that Bitcoin is looking at probably in I think they said 2140 basically Bitcoin is drying up. It's getting harder and harder to mine for Bitcoin, so it's becoming like harder and harder for people to independently find a coin, and they're not sure what this is going to do to the currency, whether the currency is going to, like, they're going to have to make more of it, or whether they're going to just keep it at a fixed rate, which was originally the plan. But essentially, whatever is going on with Bitcoin in the next, upcoming decades, is going to be very unstable, and they're not sure what direction it's going to take. And this is really, it's scary, because this is what this guy is putting entire people's livelihoods on, staking them on this very unstable financial currency, which people can't rely on.
Yeah, I'm neutral on the actual topic of Bitcoin. I don't understand any of it, so I don't, and so we have been on this program talking about how Cuba is going to has decided to allow for cryptocurrency on the island, and again, their approach has been drastically different. Right? They have a regulatory agency. They've been slowly. Announcing their next move, as opposed to El Salvador, who again, they fast tracked this through Congress. They didn't involve anybody. They didn't involve anyone in the teachers, the economists, the labor unions, the farmers. They just this guy gets elected, and he just fast tracked this stuff, and they didn't explain it properly to the people. The people were still very much confused. There's just so much confusion in El Salvador. Meanwhile, in places like Venezuela and Cuba, they have decided to use cryptocurrency. And in Venezuela, there was a recent New York Times article. I may have already mentioned this in a recent program here, where the New York Times had to admit, I believe they call it the green lettuce economy or something like that, where they had to admit that the Venezuelan economy is not as bad as the Western world is making it out to be. Like things are stabilized now. Of course it's bad. It should be much better, right? The material conditions should be much better, and that has nothing to do with socialism. It has everything to do with the Western powers. The whole let's acknowledge Juan Guaido as president. Let's allow Juan Guaido to control these foreign, assets that belong to the state of Venezuela. It's a whole, it's a whole thing that we've been covering here forever. But the point is that again, cryptocurrency in places like Venezuela is making a positive impact, according to a recent New York Times article. And if you've been following what's been happening in Cuba, they're slowly introducing this to the population, and it's very methodical. It's very well thought out. Again, I'm neutral to the topic because I just don't understand any. I don't understand any of it. But I do trust the Cuban government. I trust the Venezuelan government over this guy Nayib Bukele, who claims to be a non-ideological maverick or whatever the fuck. But anyways. Any other thoughts on that before we move on to the next headline?
I think you made a good point on how Bukele put forward this program. I think that's really the key difference in between Cuba and Venezuela, is how it's being done. Bukele came in. This program is being put forward after he kicked out a bunch of Supreme Court judges, after he removed a bunch of politicians, all of whom disagreed with him, and he put in his people in power. He's coming at this policy completely authoritarian, right? And he's just not even giving. I mean, we had that whole thing where he reposted that what was it, his Twitter or Instagram, about how he's the best dictator or the coolest dictator
in the world.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
He's not even like he's saying it jokingly, but really he's serious. It's like one of those things where you're joking but you're serious, and he is serious about it. Like, he sees himself as an authoritarian, and that's really the key difference in, I would say, in these stories.
Absolutely. It might still be on his Twitter handle. It was part of his Twitter handle, the coolest dictator in the world. Yeah. The next headline, sticking with El Salvador, Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization, is removing the high alert of former leftist FMLN government officials, concluding that allegations are indeed politically motivated. Allegations of corruption are indeed politically motivated. And, just to provide some context, the government of President Nayib Bukele is behind the allegations and that move to charge these folks as being corrupt and whatnot. In fact, Nicaragua gave a refuge to former President Sanchez, blanking on his second last name, Sanchez Serena, I believe his second last name is. And so, again, this just points towards, what you just said, Nick, is that this guy has been purging, the state bureaucracies of, former FMLN government officials. And not only that, but going after them.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on to Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, again, this is just a quick headline. The Costa Rica government is mandating all state workers to be vaccinated. That was just it there in Costa Rica. Just a little FYI there. Moving on to Venezuela. In Venezuela, Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez is accusing the IMF of hoarding $5 billion earmarked for Venezuela to help combat the COVID-19 pandemic. The IMF questions the legitimacy of the Chavista government in power, and the U.S. empire is behind this question, obviously. The IMF takes its cues from the U.S. empire, and the IMF indeed did earmark this money. So it's not just this. It's not just a baseless claim. This money is earmarked to go to Venezuela for, the purposes of combating the COVID-19 pandemic, and they're just holding on to this money and they won't release it.
Yeah.
And that's in contrast to what we talked about earlier. Cuba is here. Well, this is involving money that's supposed to be for COVID stuff. Cuba is providing, vaccines to Venezuela and to Nicaragua and other countries, whereas here's International Monetary Fund and the U.S. are, not providing these funds or doing something so they don't get these funds. Absolutely.
I thought so. This next headline was interesting. So I'm gonna just tell you where it's coming from. It's a Reuters headline, and it says the headline is extreme poverty in Venezuela rises to 76.6%. Study. When you read the headline and you read the actual article, I think they give like one line dedicated to like the Venezuelan response of why this is happening, but they provide like zero context, and it's basically just another Western perspective on the issue on the Venezuelan economy, and again it serves its purpose, right? You trust Reuters, you read Reuters, and that's the headline. And so in your mind you immediately say, okay, you read the article, socialism is bad, right? But I just wanted to point that out to folks again. This is how the Western media manipulates public opinion.
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment on that too. Like, for anyone who's doing their research on that, like issues of poverty, extreme poverty, whatever it might be, I would always recommend look at what the standard that they have is. What is the standard of poverty versus extreme poverty? Because that really makes all the difference in terms of what they qualify as. Like, is it $1 a day that's $2 extreme poverty, or is it $5 a day, right? Or is it per hour, or it? All those little things make a big difference in terms of how they can manipulate the statistics and their research. It's important to keep in mind too.
Absolutely. Sticking with Venezuela, they have elections coming up on November 21st. The European Union will be sending election observers to oversee the upcoming regional elections scheduled for November 21st. This is part of President Nicolas Maduro's effort to receive legitimacy in the eyes of the Western world. The EU Commission, however, has decided to accompany the political opposition during the elections and issue a report to either, quote unquote, legitimize or delegitimize the elections. Of course, this caused concern. This caused much concern in the Venezuelan government. And so the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry put out a statement denouncing this decision, calling it an interventionist, a quote, interventionist intention to use the electoral observation mission of the EU with a political bias, end quote. And so, President Nicolas Maduro is welcoming the EU and their commission to observe the elections. And the response is, yes, we're going to come and observe, but we're going to go hang out with the opposition. And then immediately after the election, we're going to issue out a statement saying, yeah, this election is either legitimate or not. And so that's, just in a nutshell, what's taking place. So moving on to the next headline, President Nicolas Maduro has stated that half the population has received at least one dose of immunization. He's also stated that he hopes to reach 70% immunization by the end of October. So good news there. And there are, other headlines that I didn't add to this piece, but, obviously, they're working with Cuba. They're working with China to make sure that the entire population is vaccinated. Any thoughts on that before we move on to the next topic?
No, I mean, it just shows that even without the U.S. support or any internet or Western countries support who made the most vaccines and then hoarded them, even without their support, the global South can sustain itself. It's difficult. It's not easy. It's definitely, uphill battle, but it's possible. I think that's something at least positive that you could take away from the news.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Absolutely. Next headline, Venezuela's housing project called the Great Venezuelan Housing Mission just celebrated a milestone of constructing 3.7 million homes and awarded to Venezuelan families. If you've been following the Bolivarian Revolution from the beginning, this has always been a staple of their revolution, is to be able to construct as many homes as possible for the most vulnerable, the people who need it the most. And of course, this is where it's important to provide illustrate this, because, at the height of the Venezuelan economy under Chavista rule, when oil was close to like $100 a barrel, this was just, there were just ongoing projects all over the place in Venezuela that were really helping, reduce crime, alleviate poverty, uplifted people out of poverty, address the issues of housing, healthcare, education, so on and so forth. So much so that even Western media outlets had to acknowledge that these successes. And of course, this is where, as far as I'm concerned, it was, that the United States had to hone in on Venezuela, because it wasn't just the domestic policies of the Bolivarian Revolution, which had many successes, but the fact that Hugo Chavez, former President Hugo Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez, was, the way I'm going to word it is, he was running shit in Latin America, because he was creating all types of different paradigms and different institutions to counter, U.S., imperial, hegemonic forces, and he was doing a great job of it. And so there's no doubt in my mind that, from the imperialist perspective, he had to be stopped. And so I wanted to throw this in here, because it's even with all the problems that they've had, economic problems that they've had, they're still continuing on, building homes, constructing homes, and trying to continue on with this wonderful project. Any thoughts on that, or before we move on to the next one?
It just shows the dedication of the values that a lot of these countries have. People are going to be dedicated. When they say that they care about the people, they actually mean that they care about the people. It's not like Joe Biden or Trump bullshit where it's I care about the people until 700,000 have to die. It's actual. we want to help our citizens. And we're going to build them homes. We're going to give them food. And the Bolivarian Revolution has provided all of those different kinds of programs.
Yeah, and to piggyback off that, just in contrast to the U.S. and the housing crisis we have here, where we have more homes than actual homeless people, but yet we have the issue of the houseless. You know, they don't have any housing. We don't have, the rents are too high, and it's like the total opposite.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Next headline, Spain. Spain is now recognizing Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela. I gotta laugh as I read that. As the legitimate president of Venezuela, while distancing itself from Juan Guaido, who again had, again, if you've been following our program, if you're aware of what's happening in Venezuela, Juan Guaido essentially one day declared himself president and was immediately acknowledged by the U.S. and the Western world as the quote unquote legitimate president, literally by just declaring himself president. He wasn't elected president. No one acknowledged, internally, nobody was acknowledging him or recognizing him as a legitimate president, except some, delusional right-wing forces. But that's what took place. Again, this is good news for Venezuela, obviously, but it's just a funny headline to read. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that before I go. Actually, you know what? Before any of you guys offer any thoughts, if you had any, the next headline, let me just couple that with the next headline, which is Juan Guaido is also facing problems within the Venezuelan opposition at home, as the Justice First Party issued a statement essentially breaking from Juan Guaido politically while denouncing his attempts to continue to seize and misuse foreign Venezuelan assets. I'll say one thing and then I'll wait for your response if you have any. This is the reason why the Chavistas continue to stay in power, is because there are right-wing forces, there is an opposition, except that they're fractured and they're constantly infighting. And so they could never really successfully organize themselves into one united front, because they're just constantly fighting each other. And they don't put together a real plan for Venezuela that the population can buy into. So not only are they disorganized, not only is there constant infighting, but they don't really have a plan how to govern. And so, this is Juan Guaido's reality. This is the reality of the right-wing opposition over there. Meanwhile, here in the West, we just hear that again, that Maduro is a dictator, and that he's not the legitimate president of Venezuela somehow.
I'm like, now even his own party doesn't want him. Like, they're like, well, he's not, I guess, useful anymore for them.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of like the people who were talking about the stolen election in 2020. It really shows you that, like, for all these individuals, usually right wing, who are living in like a totally different fantasy world, where Guaido's president and the U.S. is the best country in the world and this and that, and all those people who live in that fantasy world, no matter how deep they are in that world, it'll never materialize unless you actually take action to make it materialize in real life, right? So we're not concerned about whatever you think or you would like the world to be. We're concerned about actual material reality. We're materialists, right? We care about taking action to make certain things happen. The imperialists never took action to make Guaido president. Like you said, he just declared himself president, right? And it never nothing came out of it, because no matter how much you want him to be president, he's not going to become president just out of nothing. You got to make that happen. Maduro's leader of the country and legitimate president, because the Bolivarian Revolution, the PSUV, they made that happen, right? They actually organized in the streets and they got popular support.
Absolutely, and they're political force that everyone has to acknowledge. Like the Chavistas, it's a thing, right? They have a political party, they're in control of the state, and they have millions of members who support the government. And so that's just a political reality that the United States and the rest of the Western world does not want to acknowledge. They don't want to acknowledge that that's the reality. So what do? They fund right-wing opposition groups. They create media propaganda, a media propaganda war machine against the Chavista government. Now they select their own Venezuelan president in Juan Guaido, and then make sure that he has, the control of the purse, if you will, of foreign assets. It's just an entire, manipulation. It's of their sovereignty, of their right to be politically self-determined. These are all internal questions that should be settled by the Venezuelans. But Washington can't help itself. The Western world can't help itself. They're used to, this is the colonial thinking of well, we have to control these people. And just one point of clarification: the Justice First Party is not Juan Guaido's political party. He belongs to another political party, but this is part of, there's a sort of coalition there, if you will, but it's fractured. It's just, they're all over the place, and they continue as this thing progresses, where Maduro is offering, an olive branch to the opposition. They're just completely breaking down, and the Maduro government is just getting stronger and stronger. So all of the stuff that's been happening over the last several months with the dialogues and the conversations and the discussions back and forth between the Chavista government and the opposition, this is just helping. Everything's just been going in favor of the Maduro government. And so again, interesting. We're gonna, every week we're gonna keep reporting out to see what's happening, and we hope. And they're already, by the way, the Western media is already acknowledging that in these upcoming elections that the opposition probably has no chance, which we've known for years, right? But they refuse to partake in elections. They boycott the elections, and they say, "But we have a dictatorship. But you refuse to participate in the electoral process." But they continue to, call the Chavista government a dictatorship. It's just, and then they go to the West and cry to the West and say, "Hey, we need your help. Help us." So we'll continue to monitor the situation there in Venezuela. Moving on to Bolivia. Over the next week, for folks who do like to follow this stuff on your own, check out what's going to happen over the next coming days. Here's the headline: the Santa Cruz Civic Committee is calling for a protest on Monday against the MAS government, or the movement towards towards socialism government of Luis Arce, who again is the successor to Evo Morales, who was in charge of the Bolivian government for many years after he was ousted in a coup. The committee represents. So this Santa Cruz Civic Committee represents a coalition of corporate leaders, large landowners, and some of the wealthiest families. There's an individual specifically calling out for this lockout or protest is coup leader Fernando Camacho. A pro-government counter-protest has also been called for, setting up the stage for a potentially precarious and even deadly situation. So it's important that we pay attention to what's going to happen over the next week. Obviously, the right-wing forces in Bolivia are trying to make governing in Bolivia unsustainable, and so it's a very precarious situation. I'm worried about what's going to happen over the next couple of days there in Bolivia. So really, really important for folks to pay attention to that situation. Any thoughts about that before we move on to Brazil?
The Bolivian opposition, when they first took power in 2019, I think it was, right? They were seen as a joke. I remember talking to individuals before they took power, asking them about the Bolivian opposition, and they really were seen as a joke, especially in comparison to the Venezuelan opposition. But even with that sort of stereotyping of them as like not very serious, not at all very powerful, they were still able to take back power. And I think that was really what was the most concerning part, was they weren't a powerful force. They weren't really taking that seriously. Even with all those limitations, they still managed to seize power, even if it was for the short term. And I think that's, because of that experience, I think everyone, like you said, Vic, should be on their guard, right? Everyone should be cautious, very aware. And every move that the opposition is going to take now is definitely going to be highly scrutinized by MAS.
one of the cause for this protest too is that they want the coup leader, former quote unquote president,
Yes.
Janine, and they want her out of prison. You know, it's crazy. So think again. Just play this out here in the West, in the United States. Imagine. So President Joe Biden right now is the president of the United States. Imagine if Trump or someone like Trump or who's the minority leader right now in the Senate? Is it
McConnell.
McConnell. So
McConnell.
McConnell. So imagine McConnell right now organizing a coup against. Again, we understand it's a liberal. This is the empire. This is capitalism. This is a liberal democracy. But imagine just for a second, McConnell literally organizing a coup to oust Biden right now, like this week. Let's just imagine that were to happen. And then we figure out, but they play it off to the point where like it doesn't seem like you're confused. You're not sure if it was a coup or not. They play this whole propaganda machine out in the media that's like, no, it's not really a coup. This is what's happening. And then all of a sudden, a couple years from now, the liberal court, the liberal bourgeois, courts put McConnell in prison, and then somehow, people coming out there in defense of McConnell saying like, we need to get this guy out of prison. Like it's crazy. Like it's just crazy. And again, maybe that's not a fair apples to apples, because we're talking about the two right-wing forces here in the United States. But the point is that like it's just absurd that anybody would think like this lady she organized a coup against a democratically elected president. And again, this is always a question of who has power, who doesn't. Right now, Mas is in power. So you were a coup leader. Your ass is in jail. You're going to be in jail. You keep trying to commit suicide, whatever, because apparently she's tried to commit suicide a few times, allegedly, but your ass is going to stay in jail. Like you ain't getting out of jail. Like it is what it is.
Yeah. I was going to add too, you say it's crazy, but I don't really know. I don't know anymore if it'll be that crazy for people to go out there and defend people who just tried to do a coup. I think back to January 6th. January 6th.
I know. I was thinking the same thing. Yeah.
They were quite literally trying to do a coup, without really saying it. It was they wanted their person in power because he lost. That's literally a coup. And now they're doing they rounded up all the people who took the Capitol and they put them they arrested some of them. They already found them guilty. And what happened? Now they're having protests trying to get those same fucking people out of jail.
Yep.
And these are the U.S. patriots.
Right.
These people actually care about America.
And then we have evidence that some of these politicians helped plan it.
Yeah.
And nothing's happened to them.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so I don't know. In the U.S., I guarantee there'll be a good population of people who will stand right by those who are trying to commit a coup, as long as they support those and they support those people who are trying to get power. Like you said, it's all about who's in power.
Karina just said allegedly commit suicide, ha ha ha, and yes, cries to the media when she has a stomach ache. I give two shits about Agnes. I have no pity for her, and it's a question of who has power, who doesn't. And so I'm pretty sure Agnes, when she was governing, she had no problem. She slept like a baby every single night, having no problem. She had no guilty conscience. She knew what she did. They all knew what they did over there in Bolivia. And I'm pretty sure those people slept like babies. The same way that when there was a coup against Hugo Chavez, what was it, in 2002? And they took him off in a helicopter. Same thing when Manuel Zelaya, when he was in pajamas in Honduras. It's a question of power. Who has it? Who doesn't? And this is what the game is about. And so these people, this is why this week is scary, because these folks, these right-wing forces in Bolivia they're trying to make governing unsustainable, right? And so you're gonna have, and Evo Morales and his folks and those social movements out there are saying you got to hit the streets too. So this is going to be a battle for the heart of the country, like who's going to control the country. And so over the next week, we have to pay attention. I'm not trying to sound, completely, pessimistic or anything, but I'm just saying we have to pay attention to this stuff, because overnight anything can happen. You never know. Moving on to Brazil. Brazil has now passed the 600,000 mark of COVID-19 deaths. And again, just a reminder to folks, the leader of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, is an anti-science, COVID-19, essentially a COVID-19 denier. And this has led to, to this result. 600,000 people have died in Brazil due to COVID-19. I did not put, I wanted to do a little bit more research. I didn't put a headline. You folks can look up the headline, but apparently there's a whistleblower from a particular hospital in Brazil who's giving a testimony in the Brazilian Senate of how, many deaths were not tallied up as actual COVID-19 deaths. But I didn't get into the specifics of it, so maybe I'll report it on the next week. But you can look it up. It's being reported in Western media outlets.
So there's likely more than 600,000.
Well, right. So and so you always hear folks, even here the conspiracy theorists here in the United States say, well, the numbers are off because if you die in a car accident, they play this whole game of how the numbers are manipulated because, but anybody who knows anything about data, you understand that data is collected a certain type of way. And there's always going to be margin for error. And by the way, how about all those deaths? Remember New York? Remember when COVID-19 hit New York and all those DOAs, the dead on arrivals? None of those people were marked as, at least I don't believe so. I don't believe those people were tallied as COVID-19 deaths. Now, I don't know if, after an autopsy they were, but my understanding was a lot of those people were not marked as, or tallied up as COVID-19 deaths. If someone could fact check me on that, you could hit me up. But I believe a lot of those people were just not. They were simply not. And experts universally agree that whatever our numbers that are being reported, that they're actually we're underreporting. And so this idea that somehow these deaths are that people try to trivialize the number and say, well, we didn't here in the United States, or even in places like Brazil, it's not really that number. It's much, much, much lower. No, experts agree that it's probably much higher and that they've been underreported. Moving on to the next headline, Reuters headline. This is a Reuters headline. Lula, again, this is former president that they're referring to, former Brazilian president Lula da Silva. Lula keen to debate Bolsonaro on rebuilding Brazil in 2022 campaign. He maintains a double-digit lead in opinion polls. He recently went to a garbage facility to speak to workers to try to win them over. And what was unique about that particular plant was that these were people who ended up being workers at that facility, but they were actual garbage disposal scavengers before working there. Like these were people who were literally looking for garbage to find valuables or things that they can resell or recycle for money. And so, he went to that facility to make an appeal to those workers, which he's going to, it looks like he's on the campaign trail essentially now trying to win over, the Brazilian, working class. Sticking to the elections, two right-wing political forces in Brazil joined, or two right-wing political parties in Brazil joined forces and will look at potential alternatives to President Jair Bolsonaro as a right-wing, candidate, as an alternative to Jair. And so that's also something that's happening. Of course, again, Bolsonaro is he wanted to be baby Trump, and he's turning out to be baby Trump. Like the right-wing forces in the United States. The Lincoln Project, folks can look that up, along with a bunch of other, neocons, essentially, supported Biden or just told their people to not vote for Trump. And so you're seeing kind of like a similar thing play out in Brazil, where it's kind of comical when you think about it, that somebody like Jair Bolsonaro, who wanted to be just like Trump, is proving to be, even again, too much for the right-wing forces in Brazil, very much like Trump was just becoming too much to handle for right-wing forces here in the United States, or extreme right-wing forces. Let me just say that. Any thoughts on that before we move on to the next headline?
No, I think the upcoming elections in Brazil are going to be one of the most important elections in probably recent times. Even with the Nicaragua elections coming up in November are going to be pretty important. But I think it's fair to say that the Sandinistas have been making good moves to secure victory for that election. But the election in Brazil is going to be a big deal because Brazil, often doesn't get talked about like this. It is the second largest. It is one of the largest economies in Latin America. Mexico, Brazil, two of the largest economies, two of the biggest influencers in Latin America. And if Brazil was under the control, not even of a socialist, but like a social democrat or someone who was even remotely progressive, that would be a huge difference than being under the control of a far right-wing fascist who has been shown to be plotting with the United States to overthrow Venezuela, to attack Cuba, to do all these things that are clearly in support of U.S. imperialism. That would be a huge swing in the right direction if a leftist could get elected there.
Absolutely, and we've been reporting on it almost every week, and so it's our hopes here, Anticonquista, is that Lula does win and return back to power. And next headline, continuing on with our boy Jair Bolsonaro, I say that jokingly. Protests continue in Brazil, calling for the ouster and impeachment of Jair Bolsonaro. Again, so it's just his approval rating is at an all-time low. He's really, really on the ropes at this point. He's desperate, and it's just not looking good for Bolsonaro. Here's I want to go over the next headline because I thought this was next two headlines. A Washington Post headline. Some Bolsonaro supporters have called for a military takeover of Brazil. Why do they wave the American flag? That's literally a Washington Post headline. I'll read it again. Some Bolsonaro supporters have called for a military takeover of Brazil. Why do they wave the American flag? And in there, they allude to some Trump stuff and whatnot and the connections there. But I want to touch on something else, which is that, again, I want to remind folks that Jair Bolsonaro is nostalgic about the 1950s Brazilian dictatorship, which was supported by the United States government, where they were killing and murdering, assassinating young Marxists. Dilma Rousseff, former Brazilian president, a trained economist, someone who comes from Lula da Silva's political party and was the person who was handpicked by the political party to succeed Lula da Silva. She was also ousted from the government. So the Brazilian right-wing forces in Brazil not only went after Lula da Silva, they went after Dilma Rousseff. And Dilma Rousseff was a Marxist guerrilla. Back in the days. Again, maybe she's not today, who she was back then. So, and that's sort of okay. But again, it's important for folks to kind of put these pieces together. It's amazing. You can go read the piece, so here's who the Bolsonaro supporters, this is what they think, right? They want a 1950s style type military dictatorship while waving the American flag. Yep. Your response to that, if any?
No, I mean, we've already talked about this, right? It's Steve Bannon supporting Bolsonaro. Right. It's Donald Trump and all of the former Trump cabinet members and allies supporting Bolsonaro, literally doing work for him in order to help his campaign. It's no surprise that they're waving the American flag. That's their influence, right? Yep. That's who they look up to.
Yep.
So,
And we're talking about baby Trump, so.
Yeah.
Right. And in a pivot, this is just fascinating. Again, the guy is just desperate. Here's a Bloomberg News headline. All of a sudden now, this is the headline. Bolsonaro says he'll trust voting system in Brazil election next year. So again, this is his desperate attempt to right-wing forces there in Brazil to say, look, can you let me run for office? Because I'll run for office if I say this, right? So I said it, let me run for office, right? So it's just, again, and a reminder to folks, he's been questioning the legitimacy of the electoral process there, undermining their electoral system there in Brazil. And he's been doing that to cast doubt over the election so he could immediately, after the election, say, oh, just like Trump, it was stolen from me, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so moving on to the next headline. We're at the 2-hour mark. Let's see if we can just wrap up here. And again, thank you for the audience for sticking with us. Thank you to the audience for sticking with us. In Colombia, U.S. State Secretary of State Anthony Blinken will visit Colombia later this month. According to Western news media outlets, the meeting between Blinken and Colombian officials will focus on "quote unquote" human rights, social and economic opportunities, and the war on drugs. This headline to me was just fascinating because, again, there's just no shame on the part of the Western journalists. In Colombia, we've been reporting on what's been happening there over several months, and yet U.S. State Secretary of State can go over there and sit down with these folks, and they have the audacity to report that they're going to talk about human rights. They're murdering their own population. They're disappearing their own population. Activists have been getting murdered, have been disappeared in Colombia. Yet we view them as a democracy that, and a strong ally, right? And then we saw what happened in Cuba, where, by the government's own account in Cuba, one person died. Yes, many people were detained. Many people have been released. But they were literally, the activists there were literally calling for violence and, actually using violence as a weapon. Aleida Guevara, the daughter of the late Che Guevara, who, by the way, a couple days ago, everyone was commemorating the anniversary of Che's death, who died, I believe, on the 9th. I think he was captured on the 8th, died on the 9th. I hope I got those dates correctly. But Aleida Guevara was saying, I was listening to an interview, and she said, she was saying, ¿cuándo se ha visto eso aquí en Cuba? ¿Cuándo se ha visto este tipo de violencia en Cuba? Like, when have we seen, people use violence like that? We've never seen anything like this in Cuba. Like, people go and they have their protests and stuff like that. They have their grievances. We've never seen some of the stuff that we've seen, when what happened over with the July 11th protests. And so, again, I just wanted to kind of, juxtapose those two situations there. Your response to that?
Absolutely true. That's a big difference. It's crazy. We spent, I don't know how much time we spent on Colombia covering the protests, covering how the fact that, a lot of it was nonviolent. A lot of it was just done by students. A lot of it was healthcare students who were training to be nurses and doctors out there on the front lines trying to help those who are getting hit with pepper spray or tear gas, or being shot with rubber bullets, or live ammunition. This was really citizens who were not violent, who were just asking for basic respect, versus in Cuba, like imperialist actors who were attacking hospitals that were meant for people who needed COVID vaccines. So two radically different types of activists, and yet one country, the country that's a narco-trafficking dictatorship, it's a narco-dictatorship, gets treated like a democracy, whereas the socialist country that actually values human life gets treated like a dictatorship.
Absolutely. I'm seeing some of the comments. I just want to acknowledge some of the commentary here. Ill State Fishing says Latin America must expel NED, USAID, and dissolve the OAS. Agreed. Someone, Esquerdita, is mentioning some documentary there about Brazil. I'll try to see if I can check that out. And some Stephen Tremenio, I've heard some political commentators mention that Lula got further radicalized in prison. I sure hope so. That would be dope. that would be dope. And let's see here. And then someone said, Steve Bannon supporting Bolsonaro. Yeah, we've been reporting on that. All right, so moving on to the next headline. Colombian government is sending over 15,000 military security forces to its Venezuelan border. The goal is to combat FARC and ELN Marxist guerrilla belligerents. At least 10 FARC dissidents were recently killed in a bombing, according to the Colombian military. The ELN is also issuing warnings after a top ELN commander was killed. The name of the commander is Angel Padilla Romeo, who died in a Cali hospital after a military bombing along the country's west coast. In Ecuador had a national tragedy unfold after a bloody prison war led to the deaths of over 100 inmates. In a government response, 2,000 inmates will be pardoned. The government also ordered military security forces to Guayaquil jail after the violent prison war. I know I shared some images in our private chat with the comrades over here at Anticonquista. I mean, when I saw that, I just, they had headed, it was bad. The images looked crazy. And some of the reports coming out of Ecuador were just, it was just terrible, it's just interesting that this is happening again. Another, I don't look, could this have happened under a leftist president? Possibly. But we've seen this happen a few times now under right-wing presidents. Mm-hmm. And so, it was really, really just sad to read those headlines and see some of those images. And again, there were beheadings involved and stuff like that. It just got very bloody and gory. And there was just some of the images, you just saw blood everywhere. It was just crazy. Another headline here, touching on Ecuador. This is an Al Jazeera headline. More Ecuadorians leaving for U.S. amid burst in migration. Ecuadorians, this is a quote from the piece, Ecuadorians now account for the fourth highest number of encounters with U.S. federal agents at the country's southern border, end quote, per U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So I thought that was interesting because Al Jazeera, I'm not the biggest fan of Al Jazeera, but Al Jazeera is reporting it. I don't see that being reported by Western media outlets. And so just a couple things about migration. One, people move from place to place. Like that's what human beings do. They go to different, they just, decide to leave one country and go to another country for different reasons. But it's always interesting how the Western media always focuses on, migration from certain countries, right? Specifically, whether it's Mexico or Central America, and then now Venezuela and Nicaragua. They want to focus on certain countries, but Ecuador, which is headed by a right wing government, no one's even talking about that. But I thought that was interesting. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts before we move on to Peru.
Yeah, so for both those two stories, real quick, I saw another story that talked about since Lasso became president of Ecuador, there's been, and I think this is also coupled with the economic recession because of the pandemic, there's been a rise in gang violence and in the power of the cartels. And, I think that might have something to do with the prison riots and prison fights. But I think it definitely, the increase in violence because of the recession is definitely one of the main drivers of migration. And for Ecuadorians, it's kind of sad because a lot of the progress made under Correa is being undermined by this new right-wing president. And we see that in Latin America all the time. They'll take 2 steps forward and then 1 step backwards with a right-wing president.
No, it's truly remarkable. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Miguel.
No, just interesting how a lot of these countries where the migration is coming, like how you mentioned, they don't really talk about, hey, this is a right-wing government. But a lot of these migrations are coming from right-wing governments outside, maybe Mexico.
but they want to put it's important too. A lot of the migration does come from these right-wing U.S. usually governments that are allied to the U.S. But they want to focus on Venezuelan migrants or Cuban migrants or expatriates, or they don't want to focus on those who are fleeing their allies.
It's like Honduras. We got a lot of people migrating from there, and that was one of the countries the U.S. destabilized and has a right-wing government there. That's their ally.
Absolutely. All right, so wrapping up here, now we're left with Peru, and I had a few other headlines, but I think we're probably just going to end it there. Actually, no, I'll mention one other thing that I think you sent to us, either Miguel or Nick. So Peru, a couple things. Peru has a new prime minister. Her name is Milta Vasquez. She is considered, by the Western world as a quote unquote leftist. She's not a part of Pedro Castillo's government, and she's definitely not as left as former Prime Minister Guido Bellido. Staying on with Mita Vasquez, this was disheartening to read. Peru Prime Minister Mita Vasquez said redrafting of the country's pro-market constitution is not currently a priority for the government. This was a key campaign promise of newly elected President Pedro Castillo. And again, it just sort of begs the question, did have right-wing forces now just influence the Castillo administration that much to now where that's off the table? Because that was not only a key campaign promise, but as far as I'm concerned, my particular analysis of the situation is that again, this is the first time in Peru's history that post Colombia. I mean, you can make the argument that I'm blanking on his name. The Carlos had mentioned him in a prior program. There were hopes for him of being leftist, but essentially this is the first time that you have like a leftist leadership there in Peru, and so we know that all the state institutions are controlled by right-wing forces there in Peru. So how do you get around that? Well, one way is immediately putting focus and attention on the Constitution, and then creating different institutions to counter the state institutions that are being held by right-wing forces over there. So to take this off the table all of a sudden, this early in the game, that's disheartening. So I hope that we could hear from Pedro Castillo himself. But I mean, this is his new prime minister. She's essentially speaking on behalf of the administration, and it's just it was very disheartening to read that. Any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, like we've always talked about, it's his whole administration is going to be a back and forth between progressive forces, social democratic forces, socialist forces, and conservative forces. And I would even put like conservative and liberal forces are going to be working against Castillo to really restrict and limit how much progress they can make in the country. And so it'll be a back and forth. It'll be politics. It won't be perfect, and definitely I don't expect him to be able to do everything that he wants, because when you're in the electoral, when you're that dedicated and that into the electoral system, there's always going to be a limit to what you can actually achieve. That's just historically how things have played out.
And that's the part that the Western left that they don't understand. When they're overly critical of people like Castillo and Maduro and so on and so forth, they don't understand that there's two ways to take over power. Like let's just break it down to the common denominator. You could do it by force and violence, which is ideal, right? Let's just be honest, right? Which is ideal. You just take the power, right? You take power, or you do it through the electoral process. And if you do it that way, it's a political chess game. You're constantly playing chess, because it's not the ideal way to take power. And especially in Peru, where they're just he just won the executive. It's not like the rest of the institutions are not in control by the right. They are, right? And so he has to deal with that reality. In places like Nicaragua, you know, it's interesting because, you know, the military was always Sandinista, right? And so, you know, now Ortega is consolidating power, you know, and so he's as far as I'm concerned, he's doing the right thing by saying, look, you're either with the Sandinista government or you're not. You got to choose sides, because if not, this is what it is. I'm in power this time. I'm not going to make the same mistake I made last time. We're going to stay in power, and we're going to control all the we're going to just little by little start controlling all the institutions, and the institutions have to basically do what the state, you know, says. In other words, the state, his government is going to be in power, right? The Sandinistas are going to be in power, and you got to listen to what the Sandinistas are going to, you know, you're going to work for the Sandinista government, not the other way around. And if you're not part of that game, then we're going to handle you.
Right.
But even if you take power outside elections, that is the easy part. Yeah. All right. So let's see here. Just I'm going to go to two other things here. I'm going to skip over this right here just for the sake of time. A U.S. judge is clearing the way for former Peruvian President Alejandro Toledo to be extradited back to Peru on corruption charges. The State Department now has to make a decision on what to do. And somebody did, Norman Corner did mention, I was blanking on the name of the person, Humala. Humala was the guy that we had, you know, leftists here in the United States had high hopes for. Even, you know, people in Peru had high hopes for, but he would turn out to be a disappointment. Speaking about, again, Peruvian President Alejandro Toledo, he's wanted back in Peru. A U.S. judge looked over the evidence, said the evidence was, I believe the word he used was sufficient. And so he's pretty much given the green light for the U.S. government to go say, go ahead, do what the fuck you got to do. I made my decision. Now it's on you. So now the State Department has a decision to make. I seriously doubt they're going to move on this, but he is chilling in California right now. And so we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, man, it's crazy, man. It's crazy. These people just flee to this country and they get protection. Like, and meanwhile, you have thousands of Haitian asylum seekers who can't even get into this country. And meanwhile, these corrupt politicians get in like it's no big deal. Probably take a first class ticket to get here.
Yep.
Again, we talked about before the Orlando Bosches of the world, the Luis Pasara Carriles in the world. We talked about the guy who's in Israel right now. I mean, this is a pattern of the West saying to the most corrupt, the most violent criminals, genocidal maniacs of Latin America, saying, "Yeah, you want to come over here? No problem. We got you. Come on, come over. No problem." So last couple things here. I was going to touch on these three articles. So they all say pretty much the same thing. There's one in the Grandma newspaper, which is again the Cuban state newspaper, talking about the vaccine access gap in Latin America, and then so that's Grandma. Then there's a New York Times article talking about the same thing. And then Al Jazeera talking about the same thing: vaccine apartheid, the global South, etc. So, you can go for folks at home. You could, vaccine imperialism. Yeah. So folks can, Google this stuff. You can look this stuff up. We've talked about it in prior programs. But if you want to see how imperialism plays out, and if anyone says to you, well, no, it's there aren't that many benefits to living in the West. I mean, we know that's not true. But just on this issue of the vaccine, and how that was dealt with, we've been reporting out here at the Conquista. This stuff, and it's just we continue to highlight this stuff because this thing, it impacts our people, and it's real, and there's consequences to that. People die because of the way the global economy is structured and ran. So I don't know if you guys folks have any thoughts on that. I just want to touch on that very quickly before we touch on the last thing, which was, again, a piece here that was sent by, I believe, by Nick.
Yeah, no, just real quick on the COVID thing. Like you said, it's a privilege to have all these vaccines here in the United States and have access to them. And that's what drove a lot of our people, because a lot of our people did die from COVID. What drove them to get the vaccination was the fact that they realized their families back in Latin America didn't have access to it. So that's, our communities here recognize that privilege and they take advantage of it.
Absolutely. And we're going to end with this. So we're going to be almost at the 2 hour and 30-minute mark. But Nick, you had sent this over for us to review: U.S. plans, infrastructure projects in Latin America to counter China initiatives. I think this is hilarious. I've been studying some of the stuff that's been coming out of Washington as it relates to Latin America, so as it relates to Latin America and Latin America's relationship and cozying up to China. And you literally had some comments like, we haven't been, like almost like they were they've been taken aback over what's been happening over the last 20 years, because the Washington's mentality is it's a very colonial, very just disrespectful, we're there to control shit. Right. And meanwhile, China is, it's like, hey, we want to be your friend. Like, how can we have, bilateral, economic agreements? How can we help you guys? And so China, even right-wing governments, like even Ecuador recently is talking about having deals with China, economic agreements with China. So I just thought that this was hilarious title and piece, but I'll wait for you guys to respond.
Yeah. Yeah, so the infrastructure bill that the U.S. is trying to pass domestically, apparently there's an international portion of it, and basically it's all about it because domestically it's called the Build Back Better program, and the one for internationally is called Build Back Better World Plan. It's literally the U.S. is counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. I don't think it's nearly as well thought out or planned as China's Belt and Road Initiative. China's Belt and Road Initiative is very well planned, like in terms of connecting multiple different countries that are part of this economic chain of supply. Whereas the U.S. is just like, let's just throw money at our problem, and let's throw money at some of these countries in Latin America. Hope they take our side. We'll see what happens. I don't think it's going to work out too well, but it's good for some Latin American countries. Good for those leaders who are putting their money in the offshore accounts, I guess.
Did the article mention which specific countries?
Yeah, so the article specifically mentioned here's Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. Right. So you're right, 3 allies, but it's like so a couple things. It's too little, too late. Right. 2, you don't really give a fuck. You don't. You know what I mean? And 3, this is really more of like Washington realizes like, couple things. Again, what we've been reporting on, that there's a socialist revolution happening in Latin America that you can't stop, and China is partnering with the influence of China in Latin America is problematic on so many levels. There was a headline. This was a brazen headline. We don't report much on China here, but there was a brazen headline I sent to the comrades in our private chat about. I think it was a Washington Post article, I believe, that the headline read, the CIA plans to, something along the lines of create, certain.
It's CIA creates new mission center to counter China.
Yeah. And so that's such a brazen headline, and then given the nexus between the Washington Post and intelligence officials, like Washington Post had to get the green light from somebody at the CIA to run that headline. Mm-hmm. So it's like the CIA is like pretty much saying like to the world, like, yeah, we're announcing this shit and we don't give a fuck. And yeah, they keep beating us over the head with that China's our enemy. China's our enemy. Like how you have this revolution that's happening in Latin America that I keep saying you can't stop. Well, the U.S. understands that politically and economically, their number one enemy now is China. And right now, you just can't stop China. Like they're doing everything possible to undermine China. They thought, according to many analysts, many experts, they thought that somehow that China would turn out to be, like another Soviet Union situation. And it's the total opposite, right? Like the Communist Party of China is in complete control of that country. And so it's like this, you know, the imperialists, they just have no idea what the fuck to do with Latin America. And they're like super scared that China's, you know, the influence that China has now in Latin America, and that they're closing up to China, and that China's there like, yo, we're your friend, we got you. You know, my criticism of China is that they don't do enough. I want them to do more in Latin America. That's really my only criticism of China as it relates to Latin America. I wish they would say stuff like, you know, not only do we have your back, you know, economically, but, you know, we have your back politically and militarily. You know, like literally, I wish they would go to that length of saying, like, if you invade one of our allies in Latin America, you know, and look, I'm not trying to sound, you know, Mr. Macho or anything like that, but it's just a question of principle, right? Like, you know, if we didn't have China right now, the world would be a scary place. In Latin America, would be even that. It would be, you know, these are already developing countries, underdeveloped countries, third world countries that need China's help, that really, really need the solidarity of China. So, you know, I just wish China would go to an extra gear and say, like, we got your back 100%. And to this extent, I know China's probably not going to do that, you know, because they try to play nice and everything like that, even though they have this plan that, you know, of taking care of their home base, and they want to deal with the rest of the world a certain type of way. I get that. But that's really my only criticism of China, is that they don't do enough to defend Latin America. Maybe those things change. Maybe as the world changes, as Latin America's political landscape changes, you know, I've even said, like, why doesn't Latin America have like a military NATO? You know what I mean? And I know it's hard because we don't have, you know, revolutionary dictatorships yet. We don't have socialist dictatorships yet. You know, with the exception of Cuba, maybe Nicaragua's next, right? So those things can, because you have liberal democracy, those things can be fluid, right? So one day, okay, right now the Chavista government is in power, Mas is in power in Bolivia, you know, so on and so forth. But are they going to be in power 5 years from now, 10 years from now? We don't know. But yeah, I mean, that's probably, you know, that's my only criticism of China, is that they don't do enough. I wish they could do more. And going back to the headline, I just think it's hilarious that the U.S. is like, oh yeah, Latin America, fucking China, like, what the fuck do we do with this, you know? And so, like, here they go, they throw out this headline here, and then this program, and it's like, it's not gonna really, it's not. Latin America knows what's happening now. Latin Americans know who their enemy is. They know who their friends are, and so I don't think Latin Americans are gonna buy into any of this shit.
Yeah, I mean, there's more options out there now. You know, there's more options for South to South development that really doesn't rely on the predatory financial capital of the United States or the UK or Canada or any of the Western countries. I agree. You know, I think the US is getting really scared. The only thing I can, and I'm actually, honestly, I'm more surprised that the US hasn't made this more of a bigger deal, because, you know, when was the last time a country, think about all the times in history another country has tried to exert influence in Latin America. The U.S. freaked the fuck out. Like the Monroe Doctrine.
Right.
The Monroe Doctrine came out of the fact that they didn't want any European country even having a little bit of influence in Latin America. What happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis? The Soviets, you know, just make the suggestion, you know what, we're going to start working with Cuba, put some missiles there. U.S. freaks the fuck out. They're about to go to nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Latin America has always been a sensitive spot for the United States. And now it's like, you know, they have almost no control over it anymore. They can't stop people. And like you said, like, they don't know what to do. They're just throwing money at the problem, hoping that it'll solve it.
Yeah, I want to say something quick with them creating this mission center. It's probably underway already, but just watch out if anyone's like knows college students or, you know, in college. When it came to the Middle East, they created a lot of these same type of centers within universities and teaching people certain languages because they wanted to, you know, because of their interest in the Middle East. And it seems like this is the exact same thing, but with China. And there was this program that they still have. They had it at one of my schools at California State University, San Bernardino. It was like the hub for the Cal States. and it's this program called the Intelligence Community Centers for Academic Excellence. And pretty much they train all these students in this program. Usually they're like political science students, but then they take all these classes learning certain languages. They pretty much get trained to work in the intelligence community for the government, like for the NSA, CIA, FBI, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow.
So there's a good book on that I had to study when I was in grad school as an anthropologist, and how they were using social sciences and all these others programs. And pretty much that's what they do. They create these little centers. They teach you these languages. They get you these jobs to work for the government. And I'm pretty sure this is happening with China, like the same type of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't be surprised.
Absolutely. All right, so I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I mean, we're going now over a little over 2 hours and 30 minutes, and so we, as always, we appreciate the audience. Consider donating to Anticonquista, as we've donated over $100,000 to different revolutionary progressive organizations and groups and movements in Latin America and the Caribbean. Please like, please subscribe, please share, please get the word out. Shout out to some folks who signed up to be a part of a research team that I put together. Hopefully that'll help us out. And we are also looking for an executive producer. So if anyone knows of anybody who has some this type of experience, and some of the questions that we've been getting asked is because people like specifics, and we get that. But if I had to just sum it up in real, let's just say street terms, like real, just real gully terms, like say, look, this is what we want. We want somebody. We feel like we got really good content, but we need our videos to be dope. Right. We need our videos to be dope. So we want to up our numbers. We want to reach different audiences. We're not different audience. We want to be able to reach our targeted audience. But in order for us to do that, we need better quality of the videos. And so we had M1 on here from shout out to M1, brother M1 from rap group Dead Prez, and he made a great comment, which I think translates into over what we're trying to say and do here, which is that it wasn't enough just to make revolutionary rap music. Anybody can make revolutionary rap music. He said we had to make dope revolutionary rap music, right? And so, as far as aesthetics is concerned and whatnot, that's what we're trying to do. If we can find a comrade out there, love the work that you do, Anticonquista, we love y'all too. So if we can find a dope comrade that has experience or has that skill set of making dope videos, dope quality videos, like we need somebody, right? And so, just putting that out there. So definitely, to the audience, we appreciate y'all. We appreciate y'all tuning in, and again, just get the word out there. We'll talk to you guys next week. All right, guys and gals and non-binary folks. Want to be politically correct there on that one. Anyways, shout out to all to the audience, and we will see y'all next week. Salute.
Later, comrades.